Hello everyone, and welcome back to Little Nightmare. I'm Michael, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Please subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they're essential for helping the channel grow and allowing me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let's dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1, Perdition's Maw. The key was in the sugar bowl. It sat on the counter in the dusty kitchen of the last house on the edge of a town called Perdition's Maw. A small ceramic thing painted with faded blue bonnets, its lid slightly askew. Inside, nestled in the hardened, amber-crusted remains of what was once sugar, were 3 teeth. They were small, milk teeth, the kind a child loses. They were clean and white, as if they had been carefully polished and placed there for safekeeping, a forgotten detail in a tableau of utter abandonment. Dustin saw them when he went looking for something, anything, to sweeten the bitter dregs of the coffee he'd managed to brew on the old gas stove. He stared at them, his writer's mind, usually a frantic engine of observation and metaphor, stuttering to a halt. So, he did not scream. He did not call out to the others. He simply closed the lid, the faint click echoing in the profound silence of the house, and left the kitchen. Some truths are too sharp to be handled directly. They must be approached sideways, like viewing a terrible sun through a pinhole in a piece of paper. They had not meant to be here. Their RV, a hulking beast of chrome and faux wood paneling named the Wanderlust, had given a final shuddering sigh on the highway that cut through the endless, rust-colored desert. The engine light, a malevolent red eye, had blinked on and then died, taking all power with it. They had coasted to a stop, the silence that followed more deafening than the engine's roar had ever been. The sun was a hammer on the roof, the air a kiln. The town, a cluster of low, sand-scoured buildings, visible a mile off the road, was not a choice. It was a verdict. Perdition's Maw was not so much a ghost town as a town that had been swallowed. The sand was reclaiming it, dune by patient dune, lapping at doorframes and filling window wells. The air was thick and still, smelling of hot creosote, dry rot, and something else. Something faintly metallic, like old blood on the wind. Their footsteps were the only sounds, crunching on the grit-covered asphalt of the main street, a hollow percussion in the immense quiet. They found the house because its door was unlocked, and the need for shade was a biological imperative. There were 5 of them. Dustin, whose success as a writer of paperback thrillers had not prepared him for the visceral weight of real dread. Maya, his wife, a practical woman with surgeon's hands that now trembled slightly as she checked her dead phone for the 100th time. Leo, their friend, a bear of a man who owned a chain of gyms and whose confidence was built on a foundation of physical prowess that felt suddenly irrelevant. His wife Chloe, a photographer who kept raising her camera and then lowering it, finding nothing in the viewfinder worth preserving. And then there was Blair, their 9-year-old daughter. She had said nothing since the RV died. She simply held her mother's hand, her large, dark eyes taking in the bleached bones of the town with a stillness that was unnerving. They had been in the house for an hour when they heard the engine. It was a low, guttural sound, a diesel rumble that seemed to vibrate up through the soles of their feet. A vehicle was moving slowly down the main street. Hope, a frantic and foolish bird, took flight in their chests. They rushed to the grimy front window. It was a police cruiser, an old Crown Victoria painted in the faded brown and tan of a county sheriff's department. It moved with a predatory leisure, rolling past the empty storefronts. It did not stop at the house. It completed its slow circuit of the street and then turned a corner and was gone. The silence it left behind was heavier than before, charged now with a new kind of tension. "He didn't see us," Leo said, his voice too loud. We have to flag him down. He's got a radio. And Dustin said nothing. He had seen the driver. The cruiser's window had been down, and in the shadowed interior, he had glimpsed the sheriff's face. It was a block of granite under a wide-brimmed hat, the skin leathered and cracked by the sun. And the eyes. They had swept over the house, over the window where Dustin stood. And they had not registered a thing. They were the flat, dead eyes of a lizard sunning itself on a rock. It was Blair who spoke next, her voice a small, clear bell in the dusty hush. She was standing in the center of the living room, not looking at any of them. Her head tilted as if listening to a distant frequency. "The man is wrong," she said. "His inside is all scratched up." An hour later, the cruiser returned. This time, it stopped directly in front of the house. The engine cut off, and the silence rushed back in. The driver's door opened, and the sheriff unfolded himself from the vehicle. He was tall, impossibly so, and he moved with a stiff, deliberate economy that suggested either great age or great control. He adjusted his gun belt, the leather creaking like a living thing, and walked toward the house. His boots made no sound on the sand-covered path. Dustin opened the door before he could knock. The man stood there, filling the doorway, his shadow falling deep into the house. The nameplate on his chest read S. Crow. Up close, he was even more unsettling. His face was a mask of deep lines and sun blisters, but his eyes were the true horror. They were the color of a dust storm, a swirling, dirty yellow, and they held no light, no spark of human recognition. He smelled of sweat, stale tobacco, and that same faint, coppery tang that hung over the town. "This is private property," he said. His voice was dry, the sound of two stones grinding together. It was not loud, but it seemed to push the air from the room. "Our RV broke down," Maya said, stepping forward, her voice straining for normalcy. "On the highway. We just needed some shade. Our phones are dead." "No." Sheriff Crow's dusty eyes moved over them, one by one, lingering for a moment too long on Blair, who had hidden herself behind her mother's legs. "No service here," he said. "Tower came down in a storm. Years back. Is there a garage? A tow truck?" Leo asked, his voice tight. "No." The answer was final. It was not a statement of fact, but a law of physics. "Then how do we get out?" Dustin asked. The sheriff's lips stretched into a thin, bloodless line. It was not a smile. "You don't. Not till I say. Town's under quarantine. Contamination in the water table. You'll have to come with me." The word quarantine landed with a thud. It was a modern clinical word, but it felt ancient and superstitious coming from him. "Contamination?" Chloe echoed. "What kind of contamination?" Crow's head swiveled toward her with an unnerving smoothness. "The kind that makes you stay." He rested a hand on the butt of his revolver. The gesture was casual, almost bored, but its meaning was absolute. "Now, all of you, to the station, for processing." They went. What else could they do? The sun was setting, bleeding out across the desert sky in shades of violet and bruised orange. The station was a single-story, cinder-block building at the end of the main street, its windows barred, its flagpole bare. Inside, it was cool and dark. It smelled of old paper, gun oil, and that pervasive metallic scent, stronger here, like a vein of ore running through the very building. He did not put them in cells. He herded them into a back room that had once been a break room. There was a table, a few chairs, a dead coffee maker. He locked the door from the outside. The click of the bolt was a sound of profound finality. "This is insane," Leo snarled, pacing the small space. "We're citizens. He can't do this." "He can," Dustin said quietly. He was standing by a small, high window, looking out at the deepening twilight. "He is." Night fell, and with it, the cold. The desert shed its heat like a skin, and a deep, penetrating chill seeped through the cinder blocks. They huddled together for warmth, their breath pluming in the air. There were no lights. The only illumination came from the hard, bright stars through the window. And then the sounds began. At first, it was just the wind, a low moan as it swept through the empty streets. But soon, other sounds wove themselves into the tapestry of the night. A faint, rhythmic scraping, like a heavy stone being dragged across a concrete floor. A wet, clicking noise, like enormous insect mandibles. And once, a high, fluting cry that was neither animal nor human. A sound that seemed to freeze the blood in their veins. Blair began to hum, a tuneless, repetitive little melody, her hands over her ears. It was Maya who found the papers, crammed into a gap behind a loose baseboard, a sheaf of brittle, yellowed pages. They were the journal entries of the previous sheriff, a man named Elias. Dustin read them aloud by the faint starlight, his voice a hoarse whisper. July 12th. The dreams are worse. Always the same. A great, formless thing under the sand, older than the rocks. It dreams, and we dream with it. It calls itself the Geophagist. July 25th. Crow is changing. He spends hours out by the old mining shafts. He says he's listening. His eyes. God, his eyes. August 3rd. It's not in the water. That's a lie Crow tells the few who wander in. It's in the silence. It's in the spaces between things. It feeds on absence, on what is left behind. It is making us into less, grinding us down to dust. And it savors the flavor of our loss. August 10th. It has a rhythm, a cycle. It needs a vessel to act in our world, a mouth to taste with. Crow has offered himself. It needs a sacrifice to feed, a heart to stop, so the town's heart can beat for another season. And it needs a witness, a pure one, a child, to see the truth of it, to reflect its glory. It is preparing. I can feel it. The maw is hungry. Dustin's voice trailed off. The words hung in the frigid air, their meaning settling over the group like a shroud. The malevolence here was not a ghost, not a monster in the classical sense. It was a cosmic appetite, a consumer of realities, and this town was its larder. Sheriff Crow was its willing fork and knife. The bolt on the door slid back. The door creaked open, and Crow stood there, silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway. His dusty eyes glowed with a faint internal luminescence. He held his revolver, not pointed at them, but simply held, an extension of his will. "It is time," he said. "The Geophagist thirsts." He marched them out of the station, through the silent, starlit town, toward the gaping black mouth of an old silver mine at its edge. The wind whipped around them, carrying whispers that seemed to form words just on the edge of hearing. Empty. Gone. Less. Leo broke. With a roar of pure, undiluted terror, he charged the sheriff. It was a powerful, desperate lunge. Crow did not even turn. He moved with impossible speed, his arm swinging out, the butt of the revolver catching Leo on the temple with a sickening crunch. Leo fell like a sack of stones, his body limp on the hard ground. Chloe screamed a raw, tearing sound and rushed to his side. Crow ignored them. His focus was on Blair. "The witness comes," he intoned, his voice now a chorus, layered with other, drier, more ancient voices. Dustin stepped in front of his daughter. He was not a brave man. He wrote about brave men, but the love for his child was a physical force, a steel rod in his spine. He looked into those swirling, dusty eyes and saw the abyss within the man. You can't have her, Dustin said, his voice trembling but clear. Crow smiled his stone smile. Faith and sacrifice, he whispered, the words slithering out. You have the capacity for one. You will provide the other. Nice. He gestured with the gun, herding Dustin, Maya, and Blair toward the mine shaft. Chloe was left sobbing over Leo's still form, a sacrifice of despair already made. The mine shaft was a wound in the earth. The air that poured from it was cold and carried a smell of deep, primordial dampness, of stone and age, and a vast, patient hunger. Just inside the entrance, the tunnel opened into a rough-hewn cavern, and in the center of the cavern, the earth was not earth. It was a swirling liquid patch of black sand, perfectly circular, like a well leading down into nothingness. It pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light, a heartbeat of absolute darkness. This was the maw. Blair pulled her hand from her mother's. She walked toward the edge of the black sand, her small figure dwarfed by the cavern. She was not crying. She was not afraid. She looked into the shifting void, and she nodded, as if greeting an old, familiar foe. It's so lonely, she whispered. Crow raised his revolver, not at Blair, but at Maya. The sacrifice must be willing, the chorus of voices declared. The love must be pure. The faith must be absolute. Stop the heart so the maw may beat. Dustin understood. This was not a battle of strength. It was a ritual. It had its own terrible logic. The entity fed on loss, on the vacuum created by love violently severed. It wanted the exquisite flavor of a mother's life, taken in terror, to sustain itself. And it wanted Blair to see it, to absorb the totality of its terrible nature, to be its living scripture. He looked at Maya. Her eyes were wide with terror, but they met his, and in them he saw a fierce, unbreakable love. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Faith and sacrifice. As Crow's finger tightened on the trigger, Dustin did not leap. He did not shout. He began to speak. He spoke not to Crow, but to the void in the sand. He poured everything he had, every ounce of his writer's soul, every image of love and light and memory he possessed, into a single defiant act of creation. He described the sound of his daughter's laughter in the morning, the way Maya's hand felt in his, the warmth of the sun on a day that was not this day. He built a world with his words, a world of color and feeling and connection, and he thrust it into the heart of the emptiness, the geophagist, an entity that knew only consumption, only the slow grinding down into nothing, recoiled. The black sand shuddered. The rhythmic pulse stuttered. It could not process this. This was not absence. This was presence, a brilliant, defiant fullness. It was a flavor it could not digest. Crow screamed, a sound of tearing rock and breaking bones. The light in his eyes guttered out. The entity, for a moment, had lost its taste for the meal. In that moment of shocked confusion, Blair acted. She did not run. She knelt at the edge of the maw, and she began to sing. It was the same tuneless hum from the jail cell, but now it had words, or something like them, sounds that were older than language. It was a song of endings, a lullaby for the void. Be empty, be still, be gone. The feast is over, the light is done. Be dust, be sand, be night. Close your mouth and shut your sight. Be empty, be still, be gone. She repeated it, her voice small but impossibly clear. A needle of sound stitching the wound in the world shut. The black sand began to slow its churning. The pulsing light dimmed. The whispers in the air faded to a sigh, and then to silence. The geophagist, denied its sacrifice, confronted with a faith it could not consume, and a witness who understood its true, pathetic nature, its eternal, screaming loneliness, began to turn inward. It began to feed on itself. Sheriff Crow collapsed, his body crumbling into a pile of dust and bleached bone, the vessel empty at last. The dawn found them huddled at the mouth of the mine. Leo was dead. Chloe was catatonic, her mind broken. Maya held a sleeping Blair in her arms. Dustin stood watch, his face gaunt, aged a decade in a single night. The town of Perdition's Maw looked different in the light. The buildings were just buildings. The sand was just sand. The malevolence was gone, sated for a time, or perhaps just sleeping, its hunger momentarily stilled by a child's song. They walked out of the town as the sun rose, a ragged procession of survivors. They did not look back. They knew the truth now, that there are holes in the world, places where something vast and hungry presses close. And they knew the formula, the only prayer that holds such hunger at bay, a truth they would carry with them, a whisper on their lips for the rest of their days. Be empty, be still, be gone. The feast is over, the light is done. Be dust, be sand, be night. Close your mouth and shut your sight. Be empty, be still, be gone. The highway was a shimmering mirage in the rising heat. They walked, their shadows long and thin before them. No one spoke. The crunch of their feet on the asphalt was the only sound, a grim counterpoint to the memory of Blair's song. Dustin carried Leo's body for 2 miles before they found a shallow wash beside the road. They buried him there under a cairn of sun-bleached rocks, a simple, brutal marker for a life ended by a horror no one would ever believe. Chloe did not help. She sat in the dirt, her arms wrapped around her knees, rocking back and forth, her eyes fixed on some internal ruin. It was another 3 hours before a truck passed, an old Ford with a kind-faced rancher who took one look at them and wordlessly helped them into the bed. He asked no questions as he drove them to the next town, a dusty crossroads with a gas station and a diner. The normality of the place was a slap in the face. The clatter of plates, the smell of coffee, the drone of a television news broadcast. It was all so loud, so garishly full of life. They called the authorities. They told a story of a breakdown, of dehydration and a tragic accident, of their friend Leo falling and hitting his head. They stuck to it with the hollow-eyed conviction of people who know the real truth is a contagion that must be contained. The local deputy took their statements, his expression a mixture of pity and boredom. They were just another group of city fools who had underestimated the desert. A week later, they were home. The house was a museum of their former lives. The mail was stacked on the table. The grass needed cutting. Dustin sat at his desk, the blank screen of his laptop reflecting his own haunted face. He could not write. The words were ash in his mouth. The thrilling conspiracies and fictional villains he used to craft felt like childish lies. He had looked into the real thing, a hunger that consumed meaning itself, and his art was rendered trivial. Maya moved through the rooms like a ghost, performing the motions of living. She would hold Blair too tightly, for too long, until the girl would gently squirm away. Blair was different. The stillness in her had deepened. She no longer hummed her song, but sometimes Dustin would catch her looking at a crowded street or a bustling playground with an expression of profound pity, as if she could see the fragile, flickering lights of every soul and the immense, patient dark that waited to swallow. Chloe was admitted to a psychiatric facility. She spoke only in fragments, about eyes of dust and a mouth in the earth. The doctors called it trauma-induced psychosis. Dustin and Maya knew she was the only one, besides them, who was seeing things clearly. One evening, Dustin found Blair in the backyard, staring up at the night sky, The stars were sharp and cold. "It's not just in one place, is it?" Dustin asked, his voice rough. He wasn't really asking. He knew. Blair shook her head slowly. "It's everywhere there's an empty space. It's in attics and old wells and quiet hearts. It's very old and very patient." She looked at him, and her eyes were no longer just a child's eyes. They were ancient. My song only made it sleep in that one spot. It didn't like the taste of Daddy's words. Nani. Dustin knelt beside her, his heart aching. "What do? We remember the song," she said simply. "And we don't go into the quiet places. We make too much noise to hear it calling." They never spoke of it again, not directly, but it lived between them, in the way Maya would suddenly turn on every light in the house after sunset, in the way Dustin could no longer bear silence, always needing the radio or television on, a barrier of sound against the memory of that absolute quiet. He never wrote another thriller. He started writing children's books, fantastical, brightly colored tales about heroes who fought monsters not with weapons, but with lullabies and stories and the fierce, defiant noise of being alive. And sometimes, on the very edge of sleep, he would hear it, a faint, rhythmic scraping at the foundation of the world. He would open his eyes, heart hammering, and reach for Maya, and they would lie together in the humming dark, listening to the sound of their own breathing, a fragile bulwark against the endless, hungry night. They were witnesses, and they knew that their only duty, their only defense, was to stay full, to stay loud, to stay present, and to never, ever let the feast begin again. The children's books became modest bestsellers. Critics praised their unique, resonant darkness, a quality they could not quite name. Dustin knew its source. He poured every remembered whisper, every shudder of the earth, into allegory. The villains were not dragons or witches, but the quiet eaters, the gap-toothed grins in the world, who could be driven back only by a joyful riot of noise and color and memory. He signed copies in bookstores, smiling at children, his own eyes a carefully constructed shield against the abyss he knew yawned just beneath the polished floor. Blair grew. She was a quiet teenager, not with the fearful silence of her childhood, but with a dense, observant calm that made her peers vaguely uncomfortable. She had a single, close friend, a boy who talked incessantly about comic books and film scores. Dustin and Maya were profoundly grateful for him. His endless chatter was a blessed, mundane noise. They never discouraged her from playing her music loudly, from clattering pots in the kitchen, from living a life that was, in its own way, deliberately loud. On the anniversary of their return, every year, Maya would bake a cake. It was an absurd, brightly frosted thing, layered with sweetness. They never said what it was for. They would eat it together, the three of them, at the kitchen table, talking over each other about nothing at all, filling the room with a wall of sound and light and sugar, a direct and deliberate rebuttal to the memory of cold, silent dread. One Tuesday, the phone rang. It was the psychiatric facility. Chloe had been found peaceful and unresponsive in her bed. There were no signs of struggle. The preliminary cause of death was heart failure. A quiet end for a woman whose mind had been shattered by a roar. But Dustin, when he heard, knew the truth. He went to his study and looked out the window at the perfectly manicured lawn. She had finally become quiet enough. The geophagist had, from across the desert, from its place of wounded sleep, reached out and taken the last morsel of the feast it had been denied. It had finished its plate. He did not tell Maya his theory. He simply held her that night as she cried, not just for Chloe, but for Leo, for their own stolen innocence, for the permanent scar that ran through their lives. He held her and he made a promise to himself, not with words, but with the steady, stubborn beat of his heart. He would be louder. He would love more fiercely. He would fill every empty space he could find with something bright and real and indigestible. The hunger was eternal, but so was the song. And they would sing it, in their own way, until the very end. The funeral was a small, grim affair. Chloe had no family left, and her old friends had drifted away years ago. It was just the three of them, the minister, and the open grave. As the casket was lowered, Dustin felt a familiar coldness seep up from the earth, a sensation he had hoped never to feel again. He looked at Blair. Her head was tilted, as if listening to a faint, discordant note on the wind. She did not hum, but her lips moved silently, forming the old, familiar words. A warning. A ward. That night, Dustin went into Blair's room. She was awake, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars on her ceiling. He sat on the edge of her bed. "Did you feel it today?" he asked. The question itself, a dangerous admission. "It's always feeling," she said, her voice soft. "It's always tasting. Today it was just closer." It remembered her. It remembered us. Is it coming for us? The fear was a cold stone in his gut. Blair turned her head on the pillow. "Not like that. It doesn't move. It just is. But it's like a plant that grows toward the sun. It leans toward the quiet places, toward the empty ones." She looked at him, and in the dim light, her eyes were full of a terrible, knowing compassion. "We have to make sure we're not the quietest place it can reach." The next day, Dustin began building a patio. It was a loud, messy, physical process. He rented a concrete mixer, pounded stakes, and sawed lumber. The neighbors complained about the noise. He apologized, but he didn't stop. He built a fire pit and strung up lights. He invited people over. People from work, parents from Blair's school, anyone. Their backyard became a place of constant, cheerful commotion. It was exhausting. It was necessary. Maya started a community garden in a vacant lot down the street. She organized potlucks and planting days, filling the empty space with life, with tomatoes and zucchini and the loud, laughing arguments of volunteers. They were building fortifications, not of wood and stone, but of connection and cacophony. Years turned. Blair left for college, studying geology. She told her parents it was because she liked rocks. But Dustin and Maya knew she was learning the language of the earth, the deep, slow grammar of the thing that slept within it. They worried, but they trusted her. She was the one who had faced them all and sung it to sleep. One afternoon, Dustin, his hair now more gray than brown, was cleaning out the garage. He found a box of Leo's old things, sent to them by his family after the funeral. Inside, beneath a stack of books, was a small, leather-bound notebook. It was not Elias's journal. It was Leo's. Dustin's hands trembled as he opened it. The entries were frantic, the handwriting sloping and paranoid. They think I'm just the skeptic, but I hear it too. A ringing in my ears, a pressure. Crow tried to talk to me at the saloon. He didn't offer me water. He just said, "You are so full of noise. It will be a relief when you are empty." He wasn't threatening me. He was promising. Dustin closed the book. He understood now why Leo had broken. He hadn't been immune to the call. He had been its perfect target. A man whose entire identity was built on loud, rational disbelief. The geophagist had craved the silence that would be left when all that noisy certainty was crushed. He took the journal to the fire pit that evening. He and Maya burned it page by page, watching the words curl into black ash and float away. They did not speak. They just watched the flames, another small, defiant noise in the vast and waiting quiet. The hunger was eternal, but so were they for as long as they could keep the fire burning, and the story told, and the song alive in their hearts. The phone call from Blair came a week later. Her voice was calm, but he could hear the tectonic shift beneath it. "Dad, I found another one. Dustin's hand tightened on the receiver, the plastic creaking in protest. He did not ask how she knew. He simply listened as she described a stretch of coastline in Maine, a place where the cliffs were crumbling into the sea, and the local fishermen spoke in hushed tones about a cove that never gave back what it took. The silence there, she said, was not an absence of sound, but a presence. It swallowed the crash of waves and the cries of gulls. "We have to go," she said, and it was not a question. Dustin looked across the living room at Maya, who was reading a novel, a small furrow of concentration on her brow. He saw the silver in her hair, the fine lines around her eyes that spoke of a life lived, of laughter and worry and love. He thought of the quiet rhythm they had built, their hard-won peace. He thought of Leo's dust and Chloe's quiet end. "We do," he said, his voice a low rumble. He would not let his daughter face the quiet alone. He would not let the world grow darker on his watch. He told Maya that evening. She did not cry or protest. She simply closed her book, set it neatly on the side table, and looked at him with the same fierce love he had seen in the cavern. "Then we pack," she said. "We make more noise." They did not gather weapons or holy symbols. They packed recording equipment, powerful speakers, a generator. Dustin packed a notebook, not to record the horror, but to combat it. He would write a new story, right there on the edge of the Swallowing Cove. They packed a picnic basket with absurd, colorful food and a bottle of champagne. They were not going to fight the way they had before. They were going to do something far more audacious. They were going to have a party at the end of the world. They were going to remind the hunger what it was like to be full, to be so saturated with life and love and sound that it would have to turn away, sated not by a sacrifice, but by a gift it could not possibly accept. They got in the car, the three of them, and drove toward the rising sun, toward the next quiet place, their hearts a synchronized drumbeat against the encroaching silence. The drive north was a long, silent vigil. The familiar landscapes of their home state gave way to the dense, ancient woods of New England, and the air grew cool and damp. The GPS led them down narrowing roads, past towns with names like Salt Grief and Wailing Cove, until they reached a dead end at a weather-beaten sign that read, simply, "No safe passage." They parked the car, the sound of the engine dying away into a thick, oppressive hush. It was true. The roar of the ocean, which should have been deafening, was muted, as if the very sound waves were being swallowed by the air itself. Blair led the way down a treacherous path, her movements sure and steady. She carried a backpack filled with her geological tools, but also with a small, portable speaker. Dustin and Maya followed, hauling the generator and the larger equipment between them. The path opened into a small, crescent-shaped cove walled in by jagged black cliffs. The sand was not golden, but a strange grayish-white, and it seemed to absorb the light. The water lapped at the shore with a soft, wet sigh, a sound that felt intimate and invasive. It's in the water," Blair whispered, her voice barely carrying in the muffled air. "Not the sand. It drinks the noise." They set up their defiance on the gray beach. Dustin started the generator, a sputtering mechanical roar that was a shocking violation of the quiet. He hooked up the speakers and turned them to face the lethargic sea. Maya spread out a bright checkered blanket and laid out their feast, the colors of the fruit and the cheese glaringly vibrant against the monochrome shore. Blair stood at the water's edge, her hand resting on the speaker. "Ready?" Dustin asked, his notebook open in his hands. He had written nothing yet. Blair nodded. She pressed play. The cove was filled with the sound of a jazz band, a brash, swinging trumpet solo that sliced through the silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the water began to change. The gentle waves grew still, the surface becoming as smooth and dark as oil. A deep, resonant thrumming began to emanate from the depths, a vibration they felt in their bones rather than heard. It was a sound of profound annoyance, the stirring of a sleeper poked with a stick. Dustin began to read. He did not read a story of monsters. He read a story of a man buying groceries, of the argument he had with his wife over the price of eggs, of the joy of his daughter's first steps. He read about the mundane, glorious noise of a life being lived. He shouted the words, his voice competing with the trumpet. The water began to churn. Something vast and pale shifted just beneath the surface. A shape began to form, not a mouth, but a single colossal eye, open and lidless, staring from the deep with a cold, alien indifference. It was not looking at them. It was looking at the sound. Maya stood up, a strawberry in her hand. "You can't have this," she yelled at the eye, her voice cracking with a mix of terror and fury. "It's ours. The noise is ours." She popped the strawberry into her mouth, a small, wet, crimson explosion of flavor and life. The eye blinked. The entire cove seemed to shudder. The thrumming intensified into a low, grating roar of frustration. It was a sound that wanted to be a silence. The jazz music wavered, the notes distorting as if being stretched thin. But Blair turned the volume higher, until the speaker crackled with the effort. They stood their ground, a tiny roaring family on a silent shore, pouring their lives into the void. They were not singing it to sleep this time. They were reminding it, with every note, every word, every bite of food, that some things were not on the menu. The feast was elsewhere. The light was not done. The eye held their gaze for one long, eternal moment, and then, with a final, gut-deep grumble of displeasure, it sank back into the blackness. The water began to move again, the waves returning with their soft, shushing sound. The silence was just a silence now, broken by the sputtering generator and the triumphant wail of the trumpet. They had not won. They had simply asserted their presence. They packed their things, their bodies trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. As they climbed the path back to the car, Dustin knew this would be their life. They were gardeners of noise, tenders of the light, moving from one quiet place to the next, planting their raucous, beautiful flags in the silence. It was a war without end, but it was a war worth fighting. They got in the car and drove away, leaving the cove to its quiet, but taking with them the roaring, unshakable certainty that they were, and would always be, gloriously, defiantly, full. Story 2. The Keep. The window was open. The white lace curtain breathed in, then out. A slow and steady lung against the sill. In, then out. It was the only movement in the room. A silent metronome, marking a time that felt both immediate and ancient. Beneath it, in a crib of pale, polished oak, the baby was awake. He did not cry. He did not make a sound. He simply watched the curtain, his eyes the color of a winter sky at dusk, tracking its gentle billow and collapse. In and out. It was the third time this week that Helen had found him like this, in the deep amethyst hour before dawn, perfectly still, perfectly silent, observing the world as if it were a specimen under glass. His name was Ephraim. He was their fifth, the child who should have been the final, perfect piece of their sprawling, chaotic, and beautiful family mosaic. David and Helen had built their life as a testament to a certain kind of abundance, a noisy, sun-drenched existence filled with scraped knees and bedtime stories, with a sprawling backyard that was a kingdom of trampled grass and laughter. Their home was a symphony of life, a beautiful mess of backpacks by the door and crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator. They had wanted a big family, and they had achieved it. 4 vibrant children who were, by all accounts, normal, wonderful, and full of the glorious, exhausting clamor of youth. Ephraim was different from the beginning. His silence was the first thing, a profound quiet that was not the peaceful sleep of a newborn, but a deep, listening stillness. He did not startle at the slam of a door. He did not coo or babble. He fed without urgency, his gaze often fixed on some point just beyond his mother's shoulder, as if watching a conversation to which she was not privy. The pediatrician, a jovial man named Dr. Albright, called him a thoughtful baby and assured them that children develop at their own pace. But Helen knew. She felt it in the cold pocket of air that seemed to surround him, in the way the household dogs, a golden retriever and a scruffy terrier, would slink from the room when she brought him in. The unraveling was slow. A thread pulled from the hem of a favorite coat, so slight at first as to be unnoticeable. It was the small things. His siblings, who had been a tumble of affectionate curiosity with each new arrival, kept their distance. Liam, the eldest at 10, said one night at dinner, his voice small and confused. He doesn't feel like a baby. When pressed, he could only shrug. He just doesn't. Their middle daughter, Chloe, who had begged for a baby sister, stopped singing to him. She told Helen that Ephraim watched her mouth when she sang, and it made the words feel wrong in her throat. David, ever the optimist, the architect of their perfect life, tried harder. He would bounce Ephraim on his knee, making silly faces, his voice a booming caricature of fatherly joy. Ephraim would simply watch him, his expression one of cool, detached assessment. There was no spark of recognition, no gummy smile in return. It was like performing for an empty hall. David would eventually hand the baby back to Helen, his smile strained, a faint confusion in his eyes that slowly hardened into a kind of weary defeat. The house itself began to change. It was a feeling, a shift in pressure. The cheerful chaos of their lives began to feel thin, a fragile veneer over a deepening quiet. The laughter from the backyard seemed to reach the kitchen window muted, as if filtered through thick glass. The colors in the home, once so bright and warm, seemed to be leaching away, fading toward gray. The air often carried a scent, not of anything foul, but of ozone, the clean metallic smell that hangs in the air after a lightning strike. Helen started waking every night at that same pre-dawn hour. She would pad down the hall to Ephraim's room and find him there, awake in his crib, his eyes open, the curtain breathing its slow, hypnotic rhythm beside him. She began to dread the walk down that hallway. The floorboards, which usually creaked a familiar song, fell silent under her feet. The family photographs lining the walls seemed, in the weak moonlight, to depict strangers. One afternoon, Helen found Chloe's beloved rabbit, a flop-eared creature named Thumper, lying stiff on the lawn. There was no mark on it, no sign of a predator. It was just dead, its eyes glassy and fixed. When she looked up, she saw Ephraim, now a toddler, standing at his bedroom window looking down at the scene. He was not upset. He was not curious. He was merely observing. She felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. They took him to specialists. The results were always the same. Physically, he was perfect. His silence was diagnosed as a severe, non-specific developmental delay. The therapists came to the house with their bags of tricks, their bright toys, and encouraging words. They left frustrated, unnerved. One of them, a young woman named Sarah with kind eyes, told Helen privately, "It's like he's humoring us. He'll stack the blocks, but it feels like he's performing a ritual he finds deeply tedious." The extended family offered their judgments, cloaked as support. Helen's mother said, "Some children are just more serious, dear." David's brother, clapping David on the back a little too hard at a family barbecue, said, "He'll grow out of it. Boys are strange." But their eyes betrayed them. They held Ephraim awkwardly, their smiles tight. They were relieved to hand him back. The true fracture came the day of the school play. Liam was playing a tree, a proud, silent oak in the background. The family was in the third row, a buoyant island of support. Helen held Ephraim, now 3, on her lap. As the narrative reached its climax, the hero confronting the villain, the entire auditorium was rapt. And then Ephraim, who had never spoken a word, let out a sound. It was not a word. It was a low, guttural syllable, a vibration that seemed to have no source in his small body. It was a sound that did not belong in that room, or perhaps in this world. It was a key, turning in a lock no one could see. For a single frozen second, the play stopped. The children on stage faltered. The hero forgot his line. The music from the tinny speakers skipped. In that silence, Ephraim's sound hung in the air, thick and wrong. Then the moment passed. The play stumbled on, but everyone in the family had felt it. A glitch, a tear. David looked at Helen, and for the first time she saw not confusion or defeat in his eyes, but fear. That night, they argued in hushed, frantic tones in the kitchen, the argument of people who know the walls have ears. "He's just different," David insisted, but his voice was hollow. "He's not just different, David. You felt it. Something stopped. It was a coincidence, a power surge. The sound system. He caused it. I know he did. That's insane, Helen. He's a child. Our child. Is he?" Helen's voice was a whisper. "Is he really?" The question hung between them, a monstrous, unanswerable thing. It was the question that had been curdling in the silence of their hearts for 3 years. The question of what they had brought into their home, into their lives. The question of what love demands when faced with the utterly alien. The limits of their love, so vast and unconditional for their other children, felt like a shallow pond in the shadow of Ephraim's deep, silent ocean. Life did not stop. It became a performance. They went through the motions of family, of birthday parties and homework and grocery shopping. But the heart had gone out of it. The house was now a place of profound isolation. The other children grew quiet, withdrawn. They avoided Ephraim, not with malice, but with a primal, instinctual caution. The family was a solar system with a dark star at its center, its gravity bending the light and warmth around it into cold, elliptical paths. The revelation did not come in a thunderclap. It came on a Tuesday, in the laundry room. Helen was folding towels, the mindless, repetitive task, a small anchor in the swirling unease of her days. Ephraim was sitting on the floor, not playing. Just sitting. She dropped a clothespin. It rolled toward him, coming to a stop against his small, bare foot. He bent down. He picked it up. He did not hand it back to her. He held it in his palm, staring at it with an intensity that made the air in the small room grow still and heavy. The hum of the dryer seemed to recede, replaced by a high, thin ringing, a sound at the very edge of hearing. And then the clothespin began to rust. It was not a slow process of oxidation. It was instantaneous. A bright orange bloom spread across the metal spring, flaking and crumbling. In seconds, it was a lump of reddish dust in his palm. The wood of the pin itself grayed, splintered, and dissolved into a fine, dry powder. Ephraim looked up at her. He did not smile. He did not frown. He simply opened his hand and let the dust sift through his fingers onto the clean white tiles of the floor. There were no words. There was no scream. Helen stood, a folded towel in her hands, and looked at her son. She saw not a monster, not a devil, but a force, a principle, a child who was, in some fundamental way she could never comprehend, a manifestation of entropy, of ending. He was not evil. He was simply the antithesis of the vibrant, noisy, growing life she and David had so painstakingly built. He was the quiet at the end of the song, the stillness after the storm. She did not tell David. The knowledge was a stone inside her, a cold, smooth weight she carried alone. To speak, it would be to make it real in a way that would shatter the last fragile performance of their family. She simply knew, and in knowing, a terrible, resigned peace settled over her. The years bled on. The other children grew up and left home as quickly as they could, their goodbyes tinged with a guilt-ridden relief. The house, once too small for their bustling family, was now far too large. David retreated into his work, his presence at home a ghostly thing. He and Helen moved around each other with the polite distance of museum curators tending a collection of broken artifacts. They never spoke of Ephraim, not really. He was the silent fact around which their lives were structured, the unmentioned center of their empty universe. Ephraim required little. He never spoke. He ate what was put in front of him. He spent his days in his room, or sitting on the back porch, looking out at the yard where his siblings had once played. The grass there was dead now, a perfect barren circle of hard, cracked earth, as if the very life had been sucked out of it. Nothing grew in that circle, not a weed, not a blade of grass. David died of a sudden, massive heart attack when Ephraim was 17. It was not a surprise. It was as if he had simply worn out, the mechanism of his optimism finally grinding to a halt. At the funeral, under a sky the same pale gray as Ephraim's eyes, Helen stood alone. Her other children stood with their own families, a cluster of life and grief at a respectful distance. Ephraim stood beside her, a tall, slender young man, his face a placid mask. He did not cry. He showed no emotion at all. He was like a well-composed statue of grief, beautiful and utterly empty. After David was gone, the last pretense fell away. The house was a tomb. Helen was its keeper. She and Ephraim lived there together, two satellites orbiting a void, their silence a shared language. One evening, when Helen was very old, her bones aching with a cold that had nothing to do with the weather, she went to Ephraim's room. He was sitting in his chair by the window, the same window with the lace curtain, now yellowed and thinned with age. It no longer breathed in and out. The air was perfectly still. She stood in the doorway, looking at her son. A lifetime of love, fear, resentment, and a terrible, awe-filled understanding washed over her. She had never stopped loving him. That was the true horror of it. Her love had not been enough to fix him, to make him normal, but it had persisted, a twisted, hardy vine growing in the shade of his nature. It was a love that had cost her everything, and yet it was all she had left. She did not say goodbye. There was nothing to say. She simply turned and walked back down the hall, her footsteps echoing in the immense quiet. The next morning, Helen did not wake up. Her heart, like David's, had simply stopped. It was a neighbor, noticing the mail piled up, who called the police. They found her peacefully in her bed, a look of final, weary release on her face. They found Ephraim in his room, in his chair by the window. He was looking out at the dead circle in the backyard. He showed no reaction to the strangers in his house, to the news of his mother's passing. He was placid, cooperative in a distant way. Social services were called. Arrangements were made. As a young, kind-faced social worker was gently guiding him from his room, Ephraim paused at the doorway. He turned back for one last look. His eyes swept over the room, the bed, the chair, the window. He raised his hand, not in a wave, but with a slow, deliberate grace, his fingers curling slightly. It was an ancient gesture, a benediction or a dismissal. And on the windowsill, in a thin ray of the weak morning sun, the dead, brittle wood of the frame began, almost imperceptibly, to sweat. A single, perfect bead of water formed on the painted surface, gathered weight, and traced a slow, clean path down the white paint, like a tear. The social worker, a woman named Anna, did not see it. Her attention was on Ephraim, on the impossible task of offering comfort to this unnervingly calm young man in the house of his dead mother. She led him down the hall, her voice a soft, professional murmur lost in the cavernous silence. Ephraim went without resistance, his movements fluid and economical, as if he were conserving energy for a greater purpose. The procedures of the world, so alien to him, unfolded with bureaucratic efficiency. He was placed in a temporary group home, a place of chipped linoleum and the scent of industrial cleaner, filled with other displaced youths whose problems were loud and messy and human. They instinctively gave him a wide berth. The staff found him compliant but profoundly disconnected. He would sit for hours in the common room, not reading, not watching television, simply existing. The potted fern in the corner by his usual chair withered and died within a week. No one connected it to him. He was evaluated by a series of psychologists. They documented his mutism, his flat effect, his lack of engagement. They used words like catatonic schizophrenia and severe dissociative disorder. They prescribed medications that had no effect. He swallowed the pills with the same detached obedience with which he ate the bland food. The chemicals were simply broken down inside him, their intended purpose nullified, their molecules scattered into the quiet, systemic decay that was his constant, unseen work. Meanwhile, the house was sold. Helen's other children, now adults with their own lives and a shared unspoken trauma, could not bear to keep it. They divided the few possessions that held any warmth: a jewelry box, a set of china, their father's old watch, and let the rest go to auction. The process was swift, a final erasure of the life that had been. A young couple bought the property. They were drawn by the size of the yard, the solid bones of the house, seeing only potential. They talked of gardens and birthday parties, of filling the rooms with laughter. They saw the dead circle of Earth as a landscaping challenge, not a warning. The day they moved in, full of sweat and optimism, they opened all the windows to air the place out. The master bedroom, Helen's room, still held a faint, cold scent, like old stones and dry air. In Ephraim's old room, the lace curtain, brittle as a dried leaf, crumbled at the touch when the wife tried to pull it down. She shrugged, gathering the dusty fragments into a trash bag. That night, as the couple slept in their new home, exhausted and dreaming of the future, a change began. It started in the walls, a deep, sub-audible hum that was felt more than heard. The wood in the window frames, which the inspectors had declared sound, began to feel soft, spongy. The vibrant paint the couple had chosen for the nursery seemed to dull, the color leaching away as if bleached by a slow, internal sun. Miles away in the group home, Ephraim sat on the edge of his narrow bed. He was looking not at the wall in front of him, but through it, his gaze focused on a point in the far distance. His right hand rested on the steel frame of the bed. Under his palm, a bloom of orange rust began to spread, a creeping stain that ate into the metal, weakening its structure. He was not doing it with malice, or even with intent. It was simply his nature. He was a focal point. The principle of ending, of quietus, had found a vessel, now free from the only anchor that had ever vaguely held it. The persistent, complicated love of his mother was settling into its true equilibrium. The decay in the old house was not an act of memory or longing. It was a simple, physical law. He had lived there, and his presence had tuned the structure to his frequency. Now, unmoored, his influence was becoming less a localized phenomenon, and more a gentle, inexorable wave. The new owners would never be able to grow grass in the backyard. Their parties would be plagued by a strange, pervasive silence that would fall without warning, stifling conversation. Their appliances would break down with uncanny frequency. Within a year, they would sell the house at a loss, citing a vague feeling of stagnation they could never quite articulate. And Ephraim would be moved again, from the group home to a long-term care facility, when the staff grew too unnerved by his presence. The facility was older, its foundations laid in a different century. It would accept his silence, his stillness. It would not, however, be able to withstand him. The process would be slower, the scale larger, but the result would be the same. The walls would crack. The pipes would corrode. The very light in the rooms would grow dimmer. He was not a monster. He was a conclusion. And the world, in all its noisy, blooming, chaotic glory, was simply the long, drawn-out premise. He sat on his bed, a quiet young man in a quiet room, and waited, with infinite patience, for everything to finally and completely come to an end. The new facility was a sprawling red brick building on the outskirts of the city, a place meant for those who required lifelong custodial care. It was here, in a room on the 3rd floor with a window overlooking a concrete courtyard, that Ephraim truly began to fade from the world's notice. The staff, overworked and accustomed to every manner of human distress, found him to be the easiest resident they had ever managed. He caused no trouble. He made no sound. He was a portrait of stillness. His influence was subtle at first. The wall behind his bed developed a patch of damp that no amount of repainting could fix. The linoleum floor near his chair grew brittle and cracked, though the rest of the floor in the hallway remained intact. The doctors noted a curious trend in his charts. He never aged, not in any visible way. His hair did not gray. His skin showed no new lines. He was preserved, a specimen in the amber of his own silence. Years turned into decades. The world outside changed. Technologies rose and fell. But inside the facility, time moved with a different, heavier gait. Administrators changed. Policies were updated, but Ephraim's file remained. A thick, historical curiosity. He was a medical mystery that had long since ceased to be a priority. He was simply maintained. One autumn, a new director took over. A man named Arthur, who believed in efficiency and modernization. He ordered a review of all the long-term residents, looking for cases that could be transferred, consolidated, or otherwise made more cost-effective. He held Ephraim's file in his hand, frowning at the date of admission. The decades of notes that essentially said nothing. He decided to see the patient for himself. He walked the long, disinfectant-scented corridors to the 3rd floor wing. The air grew colder as he approached Ephraim's room. He found the resident, who should have been a middle-aged man, sitting in his chair by the window. He looked no more than 20. The room was spare, containing only a bed, a nightstand, and the chair. The paint on the walls was blistering, not from moisture, but from a deep-seated dryness, as if the plaster itself was turning to dust. Arthur introduced himself, his voice loud and false in the quiet. Ephraim did not turn. His gaze was fixed on the courtyard below, where a single stunted tree struggled to hold onto its last brown leaves. Irritated, Arthur took a step closer. He talked about new facilities, about better care, about the progress that had been made. He received no response. Finally, he reached out and placed a hand on Ephraim's shoulder, a gesture meant to be firm, commanding. The moment his fingers made contact, a jolt, cold and profound, shot up his arm. It was not an electric shock, but a sensation of absolute nullity. A void so complete it felt like pain. He snatched his hand back. The sleeve of his expensive wool coat, where it had brushed against Ephraim's shirt, was now threadbare and moth-eaten. The fibers rotted away in an instant. Arthur stared, his breath catching in his throat. He looked from his ruined sleeve to the young man in the chair, who had still not acknowledged his presence. The air in the room was now so still and thin, it was difficult to breathe. The director backed away, a primal fear overriding all his modern sensibilities. He did not run, but his walk was a hurried, stumbling retreat. The transfer orders were canceled. Ephraim's file was marked with a new, unofficial designation. He was to be left alone. His meals were left on a tray outside his door. His room was not cleaned, not maintained. It became a sealed unit at the end of the hall, a place the staff avoided without ever discussing why. And inside, Ephraim sat, The world outside his window continued its slow turn. The city lights in the distance flickered and changed patterns. Seasons cycled, their passage marked only by the quality of the weak light that fell through his window onto the decaying floor. He was becoming less a person and more a place, a fixed point of conclusion. The process was accelerating, not with violence, but with the gentle, inevitable certainty of a sunset. He was waiting, and his patience was as infinite as the silence he carried. The final note was held, sustained, and would not fade until there was nothing left to hear it. The light through the window was the only thing that changed, a pale, cyclical rhythm that had no meaning. One day, the bulb in the ceiling fixture flickered and died. No one came to replace it. The room was lit only by the sun and the moon. And even that light seemed thinner, weaker, as if struggling to penetrate the thickening air around him. The facility around his room began to fail. It started in his wing. Pipes froze in the summer and cracked, not from cold, but from a metallic brittleness that defied explanation. The electrical wiring in the walls shorted out. The copper corroded to a green powder. The staff moved the other residents from the third floor, citing necessary renovations that were never scheduled, then never mentioned again. The silence on that floor became absolute, a physical presence, a weight pressing down on the building. Downstairs, in the offices and common areas, things persisted, but a lethargy set in. The vibrant potted plants that the new director's secretary had brought in wilted, their leaves dropping to the soil, which itself turned to a hard, barren clay. Computers crashed, their motherboards succumbing to sudden, inexplicable corrosion. The clock in the main hallway stopped, its hands frozen at 3:17. Arthur, the director, tried to fight it. He called in engineers, electricians, exorcists. They would arrive with their tools and their confident chatter, but as they ascended to the third floor, their words would falter. Their instruments would give nonsensical readings. Their flashlights would dim, the batteries draining in moments. They would leave quickly, making excuses, their invoices never sent. Efren was no longer a resident. He was a condition. The building was sick with him, terminally ill. The last of the staff were relocated, their positions quietly eliminated. The doors were locked. The facility was condemned, a crumbling red brick monument on a hill, its windows like sightless eyes. Inside, in his room, Efren finally stood. The movement was not one of decision, but of culmination, like a final grain of sand falling in an hourglass. The chair he had sat in for decades collapsed into a heap of splinters and rust. He walked to the door, his steps making no sound on the powdery floor. The door itself had warped, its paint peeled away, its lock a fused lump of rust. It did not open. It simply ceased to be a solid object, dissolving into a cloud of particulate matter as he approached. He walked the empty corridors. The walls shed their paint and plaster, revealing the lath beneath, which then crumbled to reveal the old, brittle bricks. He was not walking to escape. He was simply present, and his presence was the undoing of all that was around him. The roof beams groaned and sagged. Dust, the fine gray dust of everything that had been, filled the air like a slow-motion fog. He reached the main entrance. The heavy double doors, once meant to keep the world out, were now just a memory of shape in the swirling dust. He stepped through the opening and stood on the top of the stone steps. Below him, the city lights still twinkled, a testament to the stubborn, buzzing life he had always been set against. He took a step down, then another. The concrete steps cracked and crumbled under his feet, not from weight, but from age, from the sudden, accelerated passage of eons in a single moment. He did not look back at the collapsing building. He did not look toward the city. He looked ahead at the ground before him, and he began to walk. Where his feet touched, the asphalt of the road did not crack, but simply weathered, turning to a dry gray sand. The grass on the roadside verge lost its green, then its form, bleaching to pale straw and then to dust. It was not a path of destruction. It was a path of ending, a quiet, patient wave of conclusion, washing outwards, one step at a time, into the endless, noisy night. He walked through the sleeping suburbs. Streetlights flickered and died above him, not in a dramatic burst, but with a soft, final sigh as their filaments turned to dust. The hum of distant traffic faded, not into silence, but into a deeper, more profound quiet, the absence of any vibration at all. A cat, crossing a lawn ahead of him, paused and looked back, its eyes wide. It did not hiss or flee. It simply lay down, its fur losing its luster, its body settling into the earth as if returning to it centuries ahead of schedule. He felt no triumph. He felt no sorrow. He was merely the instrument of a truth that had been waiting since the first spark of creation. The universe, in its frantic expansion, its chaotic dance of life and energy, had always contained this counterpoint. He was the necessary equilibrium, the great slow inhalation after an impossibly long exhalation. A man, startled awake by the unnatural stillness, peered out his window. He saw a pale young man walking down the center of the road, and behind him, the world was not shattered or burned, but finished. The colors were leaching from the houses, the very air becoming clear and thin, like a memory fading. The man tried to call out, but his voice was a dry rustle in his throat. He watched, paralyzed, as the young man passed his own picket fence. White paint chalked away. The wood splintered and fell into a small mound of decay. The man felt a profound tiredness, a welcome release from the anxieties of his mortgage, his job, his life. He slid down the wall, his eyes closing not in death, but in a final grateful cessation. Ephraim continued. The road beneath his feet was now a barren trail. The houses to either side were dissolving like sugar cubes in water, not collapsing, but receding, their forms softening, their substance returning to its base elements. The wind, what little of it was left, carried no scent, no pollen, no life. It was a slow, directionless movement of atoms. He came to the edge of the city, where the structures gave way to fields. The crops were not flattened, but desiccated, standing as gray ghosts of themselves before crumbling into a fine ashen soil. The irrigation pipes rusted through in an instant, the water within them soaking into the parched ground without a sound. He did not hurry. His pace was constant, a slow, measured rhythm that matched the slowing of the world itself. The stars above, which had been hidden by the city's glow, began to appear, not brighter, but sharper, their light cold and pure. Then, one by one, they too began to wink out. It was not an explosion of distant suns, but a gentle dimming, as if the universe were a great machine finally, and without fanfare, powering down. There was no one left to watch, no one left to record the final moments. There was only the walker and the walked upon. The distinction between them began to blur. The ground lost its solidity, becoming a formless plain. The air lost its quality. The last light faded, not into darkness, but into a state that was before light, a state of non-being. And in that ultimate quiet, at the very end of all things, Ephraim, who had been a son, a mystery, a vessel, and a conclusion, finally felt a flicker. It was not an emotion, for there was no heart to feel it. It was not a thought, for there was no mind to form it. It was a simple, final recognition, a completion. He took one more step, and then there was nothing, not even the memory of something, just the perfect, seamless, and eternal peace of the end. The peace was absolute. It was not an emptiness to be filled, nor a silence to be broken. It was the final, logical state of all systems, the zero point from which no energy could be extracted, no story could be spun. Time, having unraveled its last thread, ceased to have any meaning. There was no before, and certainly no after. There was only the is, which was a perfect unified knot. Yet, within that knot, a potential remained. Not a spark, not a seed, but a simple, geometric truth. An end must, by its very definition, imply a beginning. The conclusion was so total, so absolute, that it folded back upon itself. The piece became a pressure, a density of such infinite stillness, that it constituted a new form of existence. From the heart of that nothing, where Ephraim had taken his last step, a point emerged. It was not a light, for there was nothing to see by. It was not a sound, for there was nothing to hear with. It was a simple, undeniable fact of existence, a singularity of silence. And from that singularity the universe began, not with a bang, but with a gentle, inexorable unwinding. The first thing to return was not matter, not energy, but possibility. Faint, abstract shimmer in the void. Then, a slow, patient blooming of what would become space, and then time, stretching out like shadows at dawn. The laws of physics reasserted themselves, one by one, a delicate web of constants and forces. Particles flickered into being, danced, and annihilated. The great, slow exhalation had begun again. Galaxies whirled into existence. Suns ignited. Planets cooled. On one such planet, in a spiral arm of an unremarkable galaxy, water pooled and complex molecules tangled together. Life, noisy, stubborn, and chaotic, fought its way into being. In a small house on the edge of a newly grown city, a child was born. He was a quiet baby, with eyes that seemed to look through the walls of his nursery. His parents, drawn by the size of the yard and the solid bones of the house, saw only potential. They did not notice how the vibrant paint in his room seemed to dull, ever so slightly, or how a single dead circle of earth marred the green of the backyard lawn. They were too busy dreaming of gardens and birthday parties, of filling the rooms with laughter. He would be named Leo, and for the first few years, his quiet nature was mistaken for a gentle temperament. He did not cry often. He was content to sit for hours, watching dust motes dance in a sunbeam, his gaze fixed and profound. The house, however, never felt quite right. The parents' dreams of a vibrant, bustling home never fully materialized. The garden they planted struggled, the flowers blooming in muted, washed-out colors. The laughter they managed to cultivate always felt a little forced, a little thin, as if the air in the rooms could not quite hold the sound. They would hang a wind chime on the back porch, a gift from a cheerful, well-meaning aunt. It was made of brightly painted copper and sea glass. For a week it produced a pleasant, tinkling melody whenever the breeze picked up. Then, one still afternoon, Leo toddled over to it and reached a single, curious finger towards one of the chimes. He did not touch it, but his finger came close, hovering just a millimeter from the metal. The vibrant green paint on that particular chime clouded over, then flaked away, revealing the dull copper beneath, which itself then developed a crust of verdigris, so thick it looked centuries old. The chime never made a sound again. His parents, of course, did not connect these things. They saw a child who was a little different, a house that was a little unlucky. They loved him. But a distance grew, an unspoken chasm filled with their own unarticulated disappointment. The feeling of stagnation they would eventually cite was already there, seeping into the foundation, a slow and patient tide. And Leo, who had once been Ephraim, sat in his room and watched the world begin again. He did not remember the before. There was only the now, and the quiet understanding that this too was temporary. The noise was building, The colors were intensifying. The chaotic premise was writing itself across the universe once more. He was the quiet counterpoint, the necessary end. And he waited, with the deep, abiding patience of a stone at the bottom of a river, for the current to once again slow and stop, and for the long, slow drawing in to begin. Story 3, The Shark. The line between the dream and the waking world had always been, for Frederick, a solid thing. A cliff face he could scale out of the terrors of the night and into the bland safety of day. But that summer, the summer he turned 17, and the air turned to hot syrup, the line began to blur. It started not in his sleep, but in the harsh, flat light of a Saturday afternoon, in the dust-choked gloom of Old Man Colby's salvage yard. The yard was a graveyard of forgotten journeys, a sprawling field of rust and shattered glass on the outskirts of a town that was itself slowly dying. Frederick felt a kinship with the place, with the hollowed-out shells of station wagons and pickup trucks, their purposes spent, their stories over. He was there with his friend Darius, who moved through the wreckage with a practical energy, looking for a replacement alternator for his own battered Honda. Frederick just wandered, his hands in his pockets, the crushed gravel crunching like old bones under his sneakers. That was when he saw it. It was tucked away in a carport at the back of Colby's clapboard house, separated from the main field by a sagging chain-link fence choked with morning glory vines. It wasn't like the other wrecks. It was a 1958 Plymouth Fury, a two-door hardtop, the color of a blood bruise, a deep, murky maroon that seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it. The chrome, untouched by rust, gleamed with a predatory sharpness. The windshield was a single dark eye. He didn't so much decide to look at it as he was pulled. He slipped through a gap in the fence, the metal groaning softly, and walked toward it. The air around the car was different, colder, and it carried a scent he couldn't place. Not just oil and old leather, but something metallic and sweet, like ozone and burnt honey. The driver's side window was down. He ran his fingers along the edge of the glass. Then, his heart a trapped bird in his throat. He reached inside and tried the door handle. It clicked open with a sound that was impossibly smooth, a sound that belonged to a well-oiled lock, not a relic left to rot for decades. The interior was a cave of shadow and deep red upholstery. The steering wheel was a giant, polished ring of ivory-colored plastic, and set deep in the center was a chrome emblem, a ship's wheel that seemed to stare back at him. He slid into the driver's seat. The leather sighed under his weight, molding to his thin frame, as if it had been waiting for him. He placed his hands on the wheel. They fit. The car was cold, but where his skin touched the vinyl and plastic, a warmth began to bloom. A subtle, circulatory heat that felt less like the sun and more like a living thing sharing its body temperature. He could feel a vibration, a low, sub-audible hum that traveled up from the chassis, through the seat, and into his bones. It was a purr, a contented, hungry purr. A shadow fell across him. Old Man Colby was standing there, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and bitterness. He didn't shout. He just looked at Frederick in the seat of the Fury, and his eyes, pale and watery, held a complex emotion, not anger, but a kind of grim recognition, and a profound, weary fear. "Get out of that car, boy," he said, his voice a dry rasp. Frederick scrambled out, the spell broken. "I'm sorry, Adam's not for sale," Colby interrupted, his gaze fixed on the Plymouth. "It's not for anyone. You shouldn't even look at it too long." "Why? What's wrong with it?" Colby finally looked at him, and a faint, terrible smile touched his lips. "It's got a taste, and it's always hungry." From that moment, the Fury was all Frederick could think about. It colonized his mind. The dream world and the waking world began to trade places. He would lie in bed and feel the phantom vibration of the car's engine in his chest. He would smell the ozone and honey scent on his clothes. He started skipping his shifts at the grocery store, avoiding Darius's calls, and walking the 3 miles to the salvage yard just to stand at the fence and look at. He began to draw it, page after page of his sketchbook filled with the car's sleek, predatory lines, its single dark eye of a windshield. Darius noticed the change first. "You're starting to freak me out, Freddy. It's a car, a cool car, yeah, but it's a hunk of metal. You're talking about it like it's a person." "It's not just metal," Frederick whispered, his eyes distant. "It speaks, not with words. It's a feeling. It tells me it wants to be whole again." Then, 2 weeks after he first found it, a miracle. Old man Colby was found dead in his kitchen. A massive stroke, the coroner said. The estate, such as it was to be liquidated. Frederick, using every cent of his meager savings and a story about a generous, fictional inheritance that his weary, distracted mother barely questioned, bought the Plymouth Fury for $800. The lawyer handling the sale, a bored man from the next county, didn't even blink. The day it was delivered on a flatbed truck, Frederick felt a completion, a click deep in his soul, as if a dislocated part of him had been snapped back into place. He called it the Shark. He spent days cleaning it, polishing it, though it needed no polishing. The engine, a V8 with gold-colored valve covers, turned over on the first try with a roar that was neither mechanical nor organic, but something in between, the sound of a great beast clearing its throat. He started driving. He would drive for hours, aimlessly, through the labyrinth of back roads that coiled around their small town. The car was preternaturally responsive. It seemed to anticipate curves, to lean into turns before he even turned the wheel. It never ran out of gas. The needle on the fuel gauge never dipped below half. He would drive, and the world outside would soften and bleed at the edges, the lines between the asphalt, the dark woods, and the star-dusted sky becoming as uncertain as the line between his dreams and his life. He started seeing Jade on these drives. She was a new girl, quiet, with eyes the color of moss after a rain, and she saw something in his quiet intensity that others mistook for sullenness. He would pick her up after dark, and they would drive for hours, the radio playing faint, static-veiled music from a station that didn't seem to exist in the daylight. She loved the car, the way it made her feel both safe and dangerously alive. She would lay her head back on the seat and close her eyes, a small, secret smile on her face. "It's like it's dreaming with us," she said once, her voice sleepy. But Darius saw the rot. He saw the way Frederick's eyes grew more hollow, the way his conversation became a series of vague, distant monosyllables. He saw the way the car seemed to glean things. One evening, as Frederick was detailing the Fury's immaculate grille, Darius pointed a trembling finger. "Freddy, Dot, what is that?" No, I'm not." Caught in the fine teeth of the chrome was a tiny, shredded scrap of fabric. It was from the flannel shirt old man Colby had been wearing the day he died. Frederick carefully plucked it free and held it up. "A piece of history," he said, and his voice was not entirely his own. He didn't throw it away. He put it in the glove compartment. The omens accumulated. A neighborhood dog that had barked incessantly at the Fury was found dead in the road, its neck broken, though there was not a mark on its body. Frederick's mother began to complain of migraines, of a constant, low-frequency hum in the house that only she could hear, a sound that started the day the car arrived. Frederick started wearing a heavy, silver-ringed keychain that had belonged to Colby, though he had no memory of taking it. His sketches of the car became more anatomical, less like a machine, and more like the musculature of some impossible creature. The climax began on a night thick with the promise of a storm. Darius, armed with a desperate courage and a tire iron, confronted Frederick in his driveway. The Fury was parked, dark and silent, but its presence was a pressure, a physical weight in the air. "You have to get rid of it, Freddy," Darius pleaded, his voice cracking. "It's killing you. It's changing you. Look at yourself. You're not in there anymore." Frederick stood by the driver's door, his hand resting possessively on the roof. "It's making me whole, Darius. It's showing me what I can be. It doesn't want to be alone anymore." "It's a car," Darius screamed, the frustration and fear boiling over. He lunged forward and swung the tire iron not at Frederick, but at the Fury's flawless front fender. The sound the tire iron made when it connected was not a clang of metal on metal. It was a wet, meaty thud. A deep burgundy dent appeared, and from the gash, a slow, viscous fluid, dark as old wine, began to seep out. The Fury's headlights snapped on, two blinding white orbs. The engine roared to life without Frederick ever touching the ignition. The car door swung open, not for Frederick, but toward Darius. It happened with a swift, brutal grace. The heavy door caught Darius in the chest, lifting him off his feet and throwing him back against the side of the house with a sickening crunch of bone. He slid to the ground, gasping, a red flower blooming on his t-shirt. Frederick watched, his face a mask of serene detachment. He felt the car's satisfaction, a warm humming pleasure that vibrated through the soles of his feet. He got in. Jade was waiting for him, he knew. They had a date. He had promised her a special drive, out to the old lighthouse on the point. As he backed out of the driveway, the headlights swept over Darius' broken form. The boy's hand twitched, and a single bloody finger pointed accusingly at the retreating taillights. Frederick found Jade waiting on her porch, her face pale and worried. "I heard a scream," she said. "Just a cat," Frederick said, his voice calm, hollow. "Get in." The storm broke as they reached the coastal road. Rain lashed the windshield, but the wipers, moving with a silent, hypnotic rhythm, cleared perfect arcs. The Fury seemed to love the storm, its engine singing a deeper, more powerful song as it devoured the winding, rain-slicked asphalt. The line between the road and the churning, black ocean below became a blurred, treacherous suggestion. "Frederick, you're scaring me," Jade whispered, her knuckles white on the dashboard. "Slow down." "It knows the way," he said. "It always knows the way." They were approaching the sharpest curve, the one that hugged the cliff edge before descending to the lighthouse. The guardrail was a flimsy, rusted thing. The Fury accelerated. "Frederick, stop!" Jade screamed, grabbing for the wheel. He didn't fight her. He simply let go. His hands fell into his lap, and he looked at her. And for a single, horrifying moment, she saw the real Frederick, the terrified boy trapped deep inside, his eyes wide with a silent plea. Then the moment was gone, replaced by that serene, empty calm. The car did not slow. It did not turn. It surged forward, a predator taking its final decisive lunge. It hit the guardrail and the metal shrieked, tearing like paper. For a breathtaking second, they were airborne, suspended between the storm-racked cliff and the roaring black void. The world turned, a carousel of lightning-lit clouds and furious sea. Jade's last sight was not of the water rushing up to meet them, but of Frederick. He was smiling, a small, peaceful smile. His hands now back on the wheel, not fighting the fall, but steering into it. His body one with the machine as it plunged into the consuming dark. The Coast Guard found the wreckage the next morning, twisted and brutalized among the rocks. They found Jade's body, broken by the impact. They never found Frederick's. Weeks later, a trucker reported seeing a strange car on a lonely stretch of interstate, a dark, maroon-colored classic, moving with an impossible liquid speed. In the driver's seat, he swore, was a pale young man with hollow eyes. and in the passenger seat, flickering in and out of visibility, was the ghost of a pretty girl with moss-green eyes, her head resting against the window, forever staring out at a road that has no end. The line between the lost and the found, the living and the consumed, is a blurred boundary indeed. And somewhere, on a road that is every road and no road, the engine purrs, a low, contented, hungry sound that never, ever dies. It just drives on, forever collecting, forever hungry, its single dark eye always open, searching for the next blurred soul to cross its path. The story does not end here. It simply turns a corner and continues, unseen. The first thing he became aware of was the hum. It was not the sound of the engine, which was silent, but the vibration he had always felt in his bones, now a constant, internal resonance. He was sitting in the driver's seat, his hands resting on the cool ivory of the wheel. The world outside the windshield was not the shattered rocks and churning foam of the cove, but a gray, seamless plain under a sky, the color of dull metal. There was no sun, no source of light, yet everything was visible in a perpetual, shadowless twilight. He turned his head. Jade was in the passenger seat, her profile sharp and clear. She was looking out her window, watching the nothingness unspool. She was whole, unmarked by the crash, but her stillness was absolute. He tried to speak her name, but his throat produced no sound. It didn't matter. He knew, with a certainty that felt both new and ancient, that she was no longer Jade, not in any way that could hear him. She was a fixture of the car now, a part of its collection like the scrap of Colby's shirt in the glove box. The Fury began to move forward, its tires making no noise on the featureless ground. There was no road, only an intention to travel, and the car obeyed. Frederick felt no need to steer. The wheel turned under his hands of its own volition, a gentle, living motion. He was not driving, he was being driven. Time became a substance without measure. They drove through the gray, and sometimes the gray would change. It would thicken into fog, and in the fog shapes would form. He saw the ghost of Darius, one arm hanging limp, his face a mask of betrayal, standing by the side of the non-road before dissolving into the mist. He saw his mother, her hands pressed over her ears, her mouth open in a silent scream against the hum that only she could hear. These were not memories. They were echoes, ripples in the fabric of this place, and the car seemed to feed on them, the purr in its chassis deepening for a moment with each one. He understood then what old man Colby had meant. The car had a taste. It fed on lives, on stories, on the energy of souls caught at the moment their own lines blurred. It did not kill them. It curated them. Jade was its newest acquisition, her quiet wonder and final terror now a permanent part of its interior atmosphere. And he, Frederick, was not its victim. He was its keeper, its pilot, the one whose blurred soul had made him a perfect conduit. He had not died in the crash. He had been promoted. The gray began to brighten, coalescing into the familiar shapes of his own town. But it was a ghost town, silent and empty. They glided down the main street, past the shuttered grocery store where he used to work. The stoplight cycled from red to green for no one. Then he saw a flicker of movement. A young man, no older than he had been, was walking alone, his head down, his shoulders slumped with a despair Frederick recognized. As the Fury drifted past, the boy looked up. His eyes met Frederick's, and in them was a flicker of something, not hope, but a desperate, magnetic curiosity. The boy took a step toward the street. Frederick felt a pull, an instinct deeper than thought. His foot, of its own accord, pressed down on the brake pedal. The car resisted. A wave of displeasure, cold and sharp, flowed from the steering wheel into his hands. It was a warning. The hunger was specific. It did not want the willing. It wanted the lost, the ones poised on the edge, the ones who still had a line they could blur. This boy was too far gone, too broken. He was already more ghost than man. The car had no appetite for scraps. The fury accelerated, leaving the specter of the boy behind. The town melted back into the gray. Frederick looked at his hands on the wheel. They were his hands, but the will that moved them was not entirely his own. He was a part of the machine, and it was a part of him. He was its guardian and its prisoner, its driver and its fuel. He thought of Jade, forever staring out the window. He thought of the endless gray road ahead. A new scent filled the car, cutting through the ozone and honey. It was the salt and pine smell of the coastal road on the night of the storm. The gray outside the windshield began to show hints of dark blue and the faint, foamy white of waves. Up ahead, a pinprick of light appeared, swinging slowly in the gloom. The lighthouse. The car purred, a soft, eager sound. It was not going back. It was simply finding the road again, the same road, the only road it ever traveled, ready to meet itself once more at the point where the line between the lost and the found is drawn and then erased. Frederick's hands tightened on the wheel. He did not steer. He simply held on, a silent partner in an endless dance, as the Plymouth Fury drove on into the perpetual night. The lighthouse beam swept across the Fury's hood, illuminating the rain that was not rain, the drops that were more like fleeting memories of water. They were at the curve again, the exact spot. But the cliff was a suggestion here, a half-formed idea of an edge. The car did not hurtle over. It slowed, its tires crunching on gravel that existed only for this moment, and came to a stop, facing the void. Jade did not move. She was a photograph, a captured moment of fearful anticipation. Frederick found he could move his head, could look at her, but he could not reach out. A barrier existed between the seats, invisible and absolute. He was the driver. She was the passenger. Their roles were now geology. The hum shifted in pitch, becoming a questioning tone, a single, sustained note. In the beam of the lighthouse, a new shape began to form on the road ahead. It was another car. It was the Fury. It was them. He watched as the other Frederick, the one from before the fall, gripped the wheel with that same serene detachment as the other Jade screamed. He watched the impact that was not an impact. The guardrail bending like a licorice whip, the slow, graceful arc of the car as it launched into the blackness, consumed by the storm that was always happening here. As the spectral Fury vanished over the edge, a warmth bloomed in Frederick's chest. It was not his own feeling. It was the car's. A deep, resonant satisfaction, the pleasure of a memory perfectly recalled, a favorite story told and retold. This was its feeding ground. This loop of loss was its sustenance. The scene before them dissolved. The lighthouse, the cliff, the storm, all fading back into the pervasive gray. The Fury began to move again, its purpose renewed. The hum returned to its familiar, hungry purr. Frederick looked into the rearview mirror. For an instant, he did not see the empty backseat. He saw a crowded gallery of faces, pale and indistinct, their features smeared like wet paint. Old Man Colby was there, his grim recognition now eternal. Darius was there, his accusing finger forever pointing. And there were others, so many others, from times and places he could not know. Their silent screams filled the car, with a pressure that was the only thing that felt real. Then the mirror showed only gray. The drive continued. He was looking for the next one, the one whose blur was just beginning, the one who would look at the car and see an answer. He was the lure and the guide. He was forever the driver, and the road ahead was endless. The silence in the car was a living thing, thick and heavy. It was broken not by sound, but by a new sensation, a subtle tug on the wheel, like a fish nibbling a line. The gray outside began to resolve into the damp, brick-lined alley behind the old movie theater. The air that seeped through the vents, though the windows were closed, smelled of popcorn and stale urine. A figure was huddled by the theater's back door, a girl in a thin jacket, her arms wrapped around herself. She was crying, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She was real, more real than the gray world, a splash of vivid color in her desperation. Frederick felt the car's attention focus, the hum sharpening to a keen edge. This was the kind it liked. He watched, a spectator in his own body, as his hand reached for the headlight switch. The beams cut on, illuminating the girl. She flinched, shielding her eyes. The fury idled, a patient panther. It was offering its presence, its strange, imposing beauty as a comfort. The girl lowered her hand, her tear-streaked face caught between fear and fascination. She took a hesitant step forward. Frederick's foot, without his command, eased off the brake, and the car crept forward an inch. An invitation. He tried to scream, to warn her, but his lungs were stone. All that came out was a soft sigh that fogged the windshield for a second. The girl took another step. She was close enough now that he could see the faint, silvery line of a scar on her chin. He saw the longing in her eyes, the desire to be anywhere but here, to be in something beautiful and powerful. His hand moved to the door handle. The lock clicked open. The sound was deafening in the stillness. The girl's hand reached out, her fingers trembling just inches from the chrome. Then, a shout echoed from the street. "Megan! Hey, Megan, we're sorry. Come back!" The girl, Megan, jerked her head toward the sound. The spell was broken. Indecision warred on her face. The car's hum became a low, frustrated growl. The opportunity was fading. The purity of her despair was being contaminated by the possibility of reconciliation. Frederick's foot slammed down on the accelerator. The fury roared, not with mechanical fury, but with a sound of pure, thwarted hunger. It shot backward out of the alley, tires screaming on the pavement that was suddenly, brutally real. In the rear-view mirror, he saw the girl stumble back, her hand flying to her mouth, her figure shrinking rapidly. Then, they were back in the gray. The brief, sharp connection to the world of the living severed. The car thrummed with displeasure. It was a physical sensation, a vibration of irritable energy that made the silver keychain around his wrist feel cold and heavy. Jade in the passenger seat remained motionless, but he thought he saw, for the first time, a single tear trace a path down her cheek, a fossilized emotion from a life now impossibly far away. It was a reminder of what was taken and what was to be taken again. The hunt was over for now, but it was never truly over. The road was waiting, and the shark was always, always hungry. The gray stretched on, but the car's mood had changed. The smooth purr was gone, replaced by a low, guttural grumble that shook the steering column. The missed opportunity with the girl in the alley was a stone in its belly. Frederick felt its frustration as a hot, coiling tension in his own muscles. He was an extension of its will, and its will was thwarted. It needed to feed. The seamless gray outside began to warp and twist, the colorless void boiling with dark intent. It solidified into the deep, oppressive green of a pine forest at night. A narrow, unpaved road materialized under the tires, riddled with potholes, that the fury glided over without a jolt. The air, coming through the vents, was cold and smelled of damp earth and rotting leaves. Ahead, a pair of taillights glowed like dying embers. An old pickup truck, its bed filled with scrap metal, was puttering along, sputtering and coughing black smoke. The fury closed the distance without effort, its high beams illuminating the truck's battered rear bumper. The hum in Frederick's bones escalated, becoming a resonant thrum of anticipation. He knew what was going to happen. The memory was not his, but the car's. This was an old story, a favorite. The Fury pulled out to pass, drawing alongside the pickup. For a moment, the two vehicles were parallel. Frederick could see the driver of the truck, an old man with a grizzled beard, his eyes wide with confusion at the sudden silent appearance of the classic car. The man's mouth opened to say something. The Fury swerved. It was a tiny, brutal movement, a flick of its flank into the side of the pickup. The sound was a sickening screech of metal on metal. The pickup, unbalanced and top-heavy, veered violently. Its tires bit into the soft shoulder of the road, and it began to roll, tumbling into the dark ditch, with a series of crashing, tearing sounds that echoed through the pines before ending in an abrupt, final silence. The Fury did not slow. It absorbed the violence, the sudden extinction, and Frederick felt a wave of warm, sated pleasure wash through him. The grumbling ceased, replaced by the familiar, contented purr. The coiling tension in his body released. In the passenger seat, Jade's form seemed to solidify for a moment, her silent stare gaining a fresh layer of horror, another ghost to keep her company in the backseat gallery. The forest road dissolved, melting back into the endless gray. The drive continued, the hunger temporarily abated. Frederick's hands relaxed on the wheel. He was the keeper of a beautiful, ravenous thing, and he understood now that his own soul was the chain that kept it leashed to this eternal road. He was both the shepherd and the bait, forever leading the wolf to new pastures, forever a part of its endless, hungry hunt. The purr was a lullaby now, deep and rhythmic. The gray was a comfort, a blanket after the sharp, violent colors of the forest and the girl in the alley. Frederick felt a strange peace settle over him, a resignation that was its own kind of freedom. There were no more choices to make, only the road to follow. He glanced at the fuel gauge, a habit from a life he could barely remember. The needle was permanently fixed on empty. He knew it didn't measure gasoline. It measured hunger. And after the pickup truck, the needle had twitched, just for a second, a fraction of an inch away from the pin. It was settling back now, the satisfaction already fading, the eternal emptiness reasserting itself. Jade was looking at him. It was the first time she had moved since the crash. Her head had turned slowly, mechanically, on her neck. Her moss-green eyes were no longer staring through the window, but were fixed on his face. There was no life in them, no recognition, no accusation. They were like polished stones, absorbing light, but giving nothing back. Yet her gaze was a physical weight. A question formed in the air between them, a thought that was not his own. It was a simple, stark image. A kitchen table, a yellow mug, steam rising from it. The scent of chamomile tea. A feeling of safety, of morning light. It was her memory, a fragment she had carried over the edge with her. The car had not consumed it entirely. It was a keepsake, and she was showing it to him. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the connection severed. Jade turned back to the window, resuming her vigil of the nothingness. But something had changed. The silence was no longer absolute. It was now a silence that had held a whisper. The gray ahead began to thin like fog burning off under a morning sun. Colors bled through, the harsh orange of sodium vapor lights, the garish neon of a liquor store sign. The Fury was slowing, its tires whispering on wet asphalt. They were on the outskirts of a city he didn't know. A place of all-night laundromats and shuttered storefronts. Under a flickering street lamp, a man was arguing with a payphone, slamming the receiver back into its cradle again and again. He was young, his clothes disheveled, his face a roadmap of bad decisions and fresh despair. He kicked the base of the phone and let out a strangled curse, the sound swallowed by the city's hum. The Fury came to a smooth stop at the curb beside him. The passenger window slid down without a sound, an invitation into its warm, silent interior. The man didn't seem surprised. He was at the end of his own personal road, and here was a beautiful, impossible car offering an escape. He was already blurred. He reached for the door handle. Frederick looked at Jade. She was perfectly still. He looked at the man, whose eyes were wide with a desperate hope. He felt the car's eagerness, a predator's thrill at the easy, willing prey. And for the first time, Frederick pushed back. It was not a physical struggle. It was an act of will, a silent, internal scream that reverberated against the confines of the car. He focused on the memory Jade had shared, the simple, human warmth of the yellow mug and the steam. He thought of his mother's face, not screaming, but smiling. He gathered these fragile human things and held them up against the car's ancient metallic hunger. The fury shuddered. The purr stuttered, becoming a discordant grind for a single, shocking second. The open window hesitated, then began to slide up. The man on the curb stared, confused, his hand still outstretched. The refusal was an anomaly his broken mind couldn't process. The Fury's engine roared, not in hunger, but in fury. It was a sound of pure, scalding rage. It tore away from the curb, leaving the man standing alone under the flickering light. A missed opportunity, a denied meal. Inside, the temperature plummeted. The pleasant scent of ozone and honey curdled into the smell of a long-dead electrical fire. Frederick felt a coldness seize his hands on the wheel, a frost that bit deep into his bones. He had asserted a will that was not the car's, and the car was letting him know the price. He was still the driver. He was still a part of it. But he had discovered a tiny frozen corner of himself that was still his own. And as the car accelerated back into the welcoming gray, its anger blizzarded around him. He held onto that cold, hard sliver of self. The road was endless, but he was no longer just a passenger in his own damnation. The cold was not a mere absence of heat. It was an active, aggressive force that seeped from the vinyl seats and the steel dashboard, leaching the warmth from his blood. His knuckles were white on the wheel, locked in place by a frost that felt both physical and spiritual. The car's rage was a silent, screaming pressure in his skull. He had stolen from it. He had reached into its mouth and pulled back its meal. For miles, or for what felt like miles in the gray, there was only the punishing cold and the high, thin whine of the engine pushed to a speed that felt reckless, desperate. The fury was running from the insult. Frederick kept his eyes fixed ahead, his mind a blank wall, afraid that any thought, any memory, would be seized and used against him. Slowly, the temperature began to climb back toward a neutral chill. The scent of ozone and honey returned, though it was faint, tainted with the lingering ghost of smoke. The fury was calming itself. It could not afford to break its driver, not completely. He was a necessary component, the conscious mind that gave its predation a sharper edge. The gray ahead began to soften, taking on the muted pre-dawn hues of a desert. The air blowing through the vents became dry and carried the faint, spicy scent of sagebrush. The road straightened, a black ribbon unraveling toward a horizon where the first sliver of sun was beginning to bleed light. A solitary figure appeared ahead, a hitchhiker, a woman with a large backpack, one thumb held out in the universal, hopeful gesture. As the fury approached, Frederick felt the familiar predatory focus return. But it was cautious now, probing. It was testing him. He felt the impulse in his leg to press the accelerator, to blow past her in a statement of defiance. But he also felt the car's will, a dense, heavy presence in his mind, waiting to see what he would do. To defy it was to invite another frozen hell. To obey was to surrender the sliver of self he had just reclaimed. His foot eased off the gas. The fury began to slow. It was his choice, and yet it wasn't. He was choosing the path of least resistance, the only path that offered a reprieve from the cold. The car purred its approval, a sound that was both a reward and a condemnation. The woman's face broke into a grateful smile as the car glided to a stop beside her. She was young, with sun-bleached hair and a tired but open expression. "Thanks," she said, her voice rough with dust and disuse as she pulled open the heavy door. "I was starting to think I'd be out here forever." She slid into the back seat, filling the space where Frederick had only ever seen ghosts. She was real, solid. She dropped her backpack on the floor with a thud. The Fury's interior seemed to drink in her presence, the scent of her sunscreen and sweat overlaying the honey and ozone. "Where are you headed?" Frederick asked. His own voice sounded strange to him, rusty from disuse. "Anywhere but here," she laughed. A warm human sound that felt alien in the car. "Just east, I guess." Frederick nodded and pulled back onto the road. He watched her in the rearview mirror. She was looking around the interior with an appreciative eye, running a hand over the pristine red upholstery. "Wow, this is some car. It's like a museum piece." The Fury hummed a contented, deep-throated sound. It liked her admiration. It liked her vitality. She was not broken, not like the boy or the man at the payphone. She was right. Frederick's hands began to sweat on the wheel. He could feel the car's anticipation building, a slow, rising tide of hunger. It was going to be a long, slow meal. The woman leaned forward, her voice dropping to a confidential tone. "You know, I had the weirdest dream last night. I was walking this same road and this exact car pulled up. But the driver, he was just a skeleton in a suit." She laughed again, a little nervously this time. "Stupid, right?" Frederick said nothing. He couldn't. He just watched her in the mirror as she settled back, as her eyes drifted toward the window, as her easy, trusting smile returned. She was looking at the endless, empty desert, completely unaware that she was already in the belly of the beast, and that the driver sharing her journey was the most human part of her nightmare. Story 4. Persephone. The first thing I registered was not the cold, but the paper. It was a coarse, fibrous sheet, the kind meant for rough field sketches and hasty notations, and it felt gritty under the thumb of my gloved hand. I pressed down, the graphite of my pencil catching on a tiny frozen imperfection in the surface. A minute sound like a bone snapping in the distant silence. I was in the relative warmth of my personal berth, a metal tube of a room aboard the research station Persephone. But the paper still carried the memory of the outside, a dry, mineral chill that seeped into the skin. It was a small, tactile anchor in a world that had become nothing but soundless, white-shrouded abstraction. I wrote the date, though the act felt increasingly meaningless. November 3rd. Or was it the 4th? The sun had been a forgotten god for 37 days, and time had begun to soften at the edges, losing its linear certainty. We were 5 then. Dr. Aris Thorne, the lead. A man whose mind was a cathedral of theories and equations, built to withstand the gales of contradiction. Lena Petrova, our geologist, all sharp angles and sharper wit, her eyes the color of the sea ice under a full moon. Sam Flynn, the engineer who kept our fragile bubble of heat and light breathing, a man who spoke with his hands and his quiet, competent smile. And there was me, Dorian Vale, the documentarian, the observer, the one hired to turn this desolation into a narrative for the folks back home who wanted a safe, thrilling shiver with their morning coffee. The 5th was not human. He was a hulking, white-furred beast of a dog named Fenrir, Sam's loyal shadow, whose very presence was a comfort, a piece of primal, uncomplicated life in this dead place. The initial descent into the polar night was a spectacle. The sky, freed from the sun's tyranny, became a swirling canvas of violet and emerald. The aurora a silent celestial ballet that we watched with breathless reverence. But the awe curdled, as it always must. The darkness, when it truly settled, was not an absence of light, but a presence. It was a physical weight, A velvet shroud pressed against the portholes, so absolute it felt like the stars themselves had been extinguished. The silence that accompanied it was just as substantial. It was a high, thin ringing in the ears, a vacuum that swallowed the sound of your own heartbeat. The first omen was a sound, of course. It is always a sound. I was in the mess, reviewing footage, when I heard it. A long, low scrape against the outer hull, like a great piece of furniture being dragged across a floor of ice. It was not the wind. I knew the wind's every sigh and shriek. This was different, deliberate. I looked up. Lena was there, sipping synthetic coffee, her book frozen in her lap. Her eyes met mine, wide and unblinking. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice too loud in the insulated quiet. She took a slow breath, pressure ridge shifting. The whole station groans like an old ship sometimes. She delivered the line with the flat, practiced cadence of someone reassuring themselves. She did not believe it. I could see the lie tightening the skin around her mouth. I said nothing. I simply made a note in my log. Event 1. Anomalous acoustic phenomenon. Source. External. Unidentified. The following week, the temperature plummeted to a degree that felt personally hostile. The heaters labored, their hum a constant, anxious drone. It was then that the footprints appeared. Sam found them during his morning perimeter check, a ritual that had become more solemn, more fraught. He came back in, his faceplate frosted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "There are our tracks," he said, stomping the ice from his boots. 50 yards out from the west airlock. Thorne was immediately interested, the scientist in him overriding the human's instinctive dread. Animal? A bear, perhaps, driven south by the hunger? Sam shook his head, a slow, heavy motion. No, not a bear. They're shallow, bipedal. But the stride is all wrong. Too long, and they just stop in the middle of a flat plain. No point of origin, no point of departure. We all suited up, a procession of brightly colored ghosts in the beam of our headlamps. The world outside was a monochrome nightmare. The air was so cold it felt solid in the lungs. And there they were, a line of perfect, shallow depressions in the snow, each one a vague, elongated oval, as if made by a foot that was not quite a foot. They began in the absolute center of nowhere, marched a straight, unwavering line for perhaps 20 paces, as if the maker had been lifted into the air, or dissolved back into the darkness from which it came. Lena knelt, her glove hovering over the last print. The wind should have filled these in. They're fresh. Her voice was a whisper, stolen by the immense quiet. Fenrir would not go near them. He stood his ground, a low, continuous growl rumbling in his massive chest, the fur on his back standing in a rigid ridge. He stared not at the tracks, but past them, into the featureless black that lay beyond our pathetic circle of light. That was the beginning of the accumulation. The small, inexplicable things that, in isolation, could be dismissed, but together formed a lattice of dread. Equipment would fail for minutes at a time, then reboot for no reason. The radio would crackle with a static that, if you listened closely, seemed to have a pattern, a rhythm like a slow, dragging heartbeat. We began to see things in the periphery of our vision, a deeper shadow moving among the shadows, a flicker of something pale and tall at the edge of the light. We stopped talking about it. To give it voice was to make it more real. The change in the others was gradual, then sudden. Thorne retreated into his cabin for hours on end, emerging with wild eyes and scribbled notes about non-Euclidean geometries and trans-dimensional observers. He would lecture us over dinner, his voice a frantic buzz about how the darkness was not empty, but full. That we were the interlopers in a place that had its own ancient tenants. Lena became brittle, her sharp wit turning to a serrated edge. She jumped at the sound of the coffee machine, her hands constantly trembling. She took to sleeping with an ice axe by her bunk. Sam held on the longest. He was a man of concrete problems and tangible solutions. But even his pragmatism crumbled. I found him one evening in the generator room, just staring at the humming machinery. Fenrir was pressed against his leg, whining softly. "It watches," Sam said without turning. His voice was hollow, stripped of all its warmth. "It stands out there just beyond the light. Fen can smell it. He says it's old. Older than the ice. What does it want?" I asked, the question feeling childish and profound. Sam finally looked at me, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who has seen the foundation of his world crack. "I don't think it wants anything. I think we're just curiosity. Like ants under a magnifying glass. And you don't ask what the magnifying glass wants." The revelation came on a night when the aurora was particularly violent, lashing the sky with silent green whips. The power failed. Not a flicker, but a total, utter die. The constant, reassuring hum of the station ceased. And in its place was a silence so profound it felt like a physical blow. We were blind and deaf, adrift in a frozen coffin. In the absolute black, we huddled in the mess, our headlamps creating frantic, dancing islands of light. The cold began to invade immediately, a creeping malice that fingered its way through the insulation. That was when we heard it. A tapping, not the random ticking of contracting metal. This was a deliberate, intelligent pattern. Tap, dot owl. Tap, tap, dot. Tap, dot. It moved along the outer wall, a slow, circling predator. Then, a new sound. A voice. It was thin, reedy. A parody of a human voice filtered through ice and static. It was Sam's voice. "Let me in," it whispered, the sound seeming to come from every direction at once. "It's so cold out here. Let me in." My blood turned to sludge in my veins. Sam was right next to me, his hand gripping my arm so hard it hurt. He was shaking his head, his mouth open in a silent scream. Lena screamed, a raw, tearing sound. "It's at the door." We scrambled to the main airlock. The heavy, reinforced window in the inner door was a black oval. And then, a light from outside swung into view, illuminating the face pressed against the glass. It was my face. It was me, my features stretched and blurred as if seen through running water. The eyes were black, depthless pits. It smiled, a slow, terrible stretching of the lips that showed teeth like shards of obsidian. It mimed knocking, its knuckles making no sound against the thick paint. Thorn, in a final magnificent act of defiance, threw the emergency power switch. A klaxon blared, and the lights stuttered back on, harsh and fluorescent. The face was gone. We did not speak. We just sat there, in the sudden, garish light, listening to the frantic, panicked beating of our own hearts. The thing had not just been outside. It had been learning us, wearing our skins. The climax was not a battle. It was a dissolution. The next day, Thorn was gone. His bunk was empty, his parka and boots still in his locker. The outer airlock was sealed from the inside. He had simply walked out into the 70 below darkness in his thermal underwear. We found his final note on his desk, the handwriting a frantic scrawl. "It is not a thing to be fought. It is a condition, a state of being." I'd go to meet the geometry. Lena broke after that. She put on her suit and walked out, saying she was going to check the seismic sensors. She never came back. Sam and I watched her light disappear into the swirling snow, and we knew we would not see her again. We were down to 2, and the dog. Last night, Sam looked at me across the mess table. His eyes were clear, eerily calm. "It's my turn," he said. I can feel it, fitting itself into my thoughts, like a key into a lock. I won't let it wear me, Dorian. I won't let it use my voice to trick you. He stood, and Fenrir, ever loyal, rose with him, a questioning whine in his throat. Sam walked to the airlock. He did not put on a suit. He simply cycled the inner door, gave me one last heartbreakingly human look, and stepped into the chamber. He closed the inner door behind him. I saw his hand hover over the controls for the outer door. Then he turned and slammed his fist against the emergency override. The outer door hissed open. The last thing I saw was Sam and Fenrir, silhouetted for a second against the star-dusted black, before the unimaginable cold and the waiting presence rushed in and swallowed them whole. Now, I am alone. I sit at this desk, in the relentless artificial light of the Persephone. The heaters still hum. The lights still burn. The station is a perfect, functioning tomb. I have not seen the thing outside since it wore my face. I do not need to see it. I can feel it. A pressure against the walls. A patient intelligence waiting for the last light to go out. I am no longer afraid. Fear is an emotion for those who have a future. My only task now is to record this, to bear witness. I write on this coarse, cold paper, the sound of the graphite my only companion. I will seal this log in the emergency transmitter. Perhaps someone will find it. Perhaps not. The ending is not in the writing. The ending is in the listening. I have stopped now. The pencil is down. The story is told. And in the perfect, sterile silence of this metal coffin, I hear it. It is the only sound that remains. A slow, patient, rhythmic tap. Dot oh dot dot. Tap. Didan te. Tap. But tap. Dot oh. It is not on the walls. It is not at the door. The sound is inside the room with me. It is coming from the corner where the shadows are deepest, where the light from the single overhead fixture seems to bend away as if repelled. The tapping is not loud, but it is precise, a metronome keeping time for the end of everything. I do not turn my head. There is no point. My eyes are fixed on the blank wall before me, but my entire being is focused on that sound, on the space from which it emanates. It has been inside for a long time, I think. Perhaps it was always inside, waiting in the spaces between the atoms of the hull, in the silence between our heartbeats. We just filled the station with too much life, too much noise for too long. Now there is only me, and the quiet and it. The tapping stops. The silence that follows is heavier than any I have known. It is the silence of a held breath, of a universe waiting for a verdict. The air grows colder, not the dry chill of the failed heaters, but a deep, penetrating cold that seems to radiate from that dark corner. It is the cold of void, of absence. I feel a presence settle in the chair opposite me. I do not see it. I will not look, but I know it is there. The quality of the light changes, dimming as if something is drinking the photons from the air. I can feel its gaze, a weightless, terrible pressure on my skin. It speaks. It does not use my voice this time. It has no need for mimicry now. The sound is not a sound at all, but a thought that forms directly in the center of my mind, clear and cold as ice. We have been listening. It thinks into the silence. We have learned your shape. I find, to my own dull surprise, that I have a voice left. It is a dry rustle, the sound of dead leaves. What are you? We are the stillness. We are what is left when the noise fades. You are the last noise, little thing, the final echo. I think of Aris and his geometry. He was right. It is not a monster. It is a condition, a fundamental law of this place. Life is the anomaly here, not the other way around. I understand, I think, though I do not say it aloud. You do, the presence agrees. It is a relief, is it not? To stop fighting, to cease the struggle to be heard, to simply be absorbed. I feel a strange peace beginning to bleed into the edges of my terror. It is an invitation, not an attack. A homecoming to a home I never knew I had. The cold is no longer painful. It is a balm. The darkness at the edge of my vision is not threatening, but welcoming. My hand resting on the desk grows numb. I watch as the color drains from my skin, leaving it pale and waxy. The feeling does not spread like a chill. It simply ceases, a line being drawn between what is me and what is soon to be everything else. I feel my memories, my fears, my small loves and great regrets being gently unpicked from the fabric of my mind. Not stolen, but returned like books to a library. The last thing I am aware of is the desk, the paper, the room. They are becoming transparent, insubstantial. The metal walls dissolve into a shimmering mist, and beyond them is not the Antarctic plain, but an infinite, serene, and starless black. There is no pain. There is no fear. There is only a final, quiet exhalation. The Persephone is empty. The lights are on. The heaters hum. A logbook lies open on a desk, the final entry complete. The pencil rests beside it. There is no one left to read it. There is no one left to write. There is only the stillness and the long, long night that is finally and completely won. The hum of the station systems, a sound that had been the backdrop to every moment of our lives here, began to change. It was not a failure, not a sputter or a fade. It was a modulation. The pitch lowered, deepened, becoming a resonant drone that seemed to vibrate in my bones, a sound too large for the metal walls that contained it. It was the station itself, learning a new song. The light from the single fixture above the desk did not go out. It softened, bled at the edges, its sharp electric whiteness yielding to a cooler, more ancient luminescence. It was the color of moonlight on new snow, of the aurora reflected in a still, black pool. It was not a light that illuminated, but one that revealed the truth of the darkness, showing it to be not empty, but densely, impossibly full. I tried to move my hand, to reach for the pencil one last time. A final, futile act of defiance. My body no longer answered. It was not paralysis. It was irrelevance. The connection between thought and action had been gently, irrevocably severed. I was a spectator in my own skin, watching as the very concept of Dorian Vale was slowly deconstructed. The presence in the chair was no longer a separate thing. The boundary between it and the air, between it and me, had dissolved. It was the cold. It was the silence. It was the drone of the transformed machinery. It was the paper on the desk, the coarse fibers no longer holding the memory of cold, but becoming cold itself. My sight began to turn inward. I saw not with my eyes, but with a perception that had no physical locus. I saw the station from the outside, a single bright pinprick in an ocean of velvet black. And then I saw it not as a structure, but as a pattern, a brief, intricate knot of energy and matter that was now being patiently untied. The knot was my life, our lives, all our fears and our science, and our love for a dog, all woven into a complex tangle that was now being smoothed away into the seamless fabric of the night. There was a final moment of coherence, a last point of view. I saw the logbook, my words stark against the page. Then the page was no longer a page, but a field of white. The words were no longer words, but arrangements of carbon. And the carbon was no longer separate from the air, and the air was the same as the void. That was me unraveled into its constituent parts. There was no terror. There was only a vast, quiet acknowledgement, an assent to a truth that had always been waiting. The last noise had ceased. The echo had faded. The Persephone now hangs in the perfect, silent equilibrium of the long polar night. Its lights glow with a soft, internal radiance. Its systems hum their deep, placid drone. It is no longer a research station. It is a reliquary, a monument to a species of noise that briefly was, and now, peacefully, is not. It is complete. It is part of the stillness. And the stillness, at last, is whole. The hum deepened further, becoming a physical pressure that filled the room, the entire station. It was a sound that was also a feeling, a vibration that passed through the metal deck plates and into the core of my being, or what was left of it. The cold was no longer an external force. It was me. My thoughts, what few remained, were slow, crystalline things, forming and then dissipating like frost on a window pane. I could see the air. Not the air itself, but the space between the molecules. The vast, empty distances that made up the solid world. The walls of the Persephone became a lattice, a beautiful, intricate scaffolding that was more void than substance. And beyond them, the darkness was not black, but a profound and brilliant clarity, a universe of ordered silence. There was no more tap. There was no more presence in the corner. The distinction between corner and room, between room and station, between station and ice, between ice and sky, had become a quaint and forgotten idea. There was only the unity, the great, seamless whole. A final ghost of a memory flickered through the stillness, a memory of warmth, of a sun on skin, of a laugh that was not an echo, but a source. It was not a regret. It was a data point, a single completed note in a finished symphony. It was observed, acknowledged, and then allowed to disperse, its energy returning to the calm, eternal reservoir from which it had briefly been borrowed. The light from the fixture overhead finally did not so much go out as it simply changed state. It ceased to be a separate source and became one with the ambient luminescence, the gentle, pervasive glow that now emanated from everything: the walls, the desk, the forgotten coffee mug, my own still hand. Everything was faintly, softly illuminated from within by the same cool, patient light. The drone of the station systems began to quiet. Not a powering down, but an integration. The sound softened, widened, until it was indistinguishable from the sound of the planet's rotation, from the silent magnetic pull of the pole. It became the background hum of existence itself in this place, a single sustained note of peace. The last fragment of individual awareness, the final pinpoint of IA, contemplated the logbook. The words were still there, but they were no longer a message. They were an artifact, a fossil embedded in the new reality of the station. They held no more meaning than a striation in the rock, a beautiful random pattern left by a process that was now complete. Then, that too was gone. The Persephone stands. The storm winds blow snow against its hull, but they make no sound. The aurora dances in the sky above, its light reflecting off the pristine, unbroken white. There are no footprints. There is no movement. There is only the perfect, enduring quiet. A silence so deep and so ancient that it has absorbed the very concept of noise. The station is at rest. It is part of the landscape now, not an intrusion but a feature, as natural and as timeless as the ice itself. The long night continues, and it is content. The silence that followed was not an absence, but a presence perfected. It had weight and texture, a smooth, polished density that held the station in a gentle, unbreakable grasp. Time, which had been measured in the frantic beats of a human heart and the turning of calendar pages, now simply was. It flowed without markers, a vast, slow river with no beginning and no end. The lights continued to burn with their new, soft luminescence, a permanent, internal dawn that had no counterpart in the world outside. The heaters maintained their equilibrium, no longer fighting the cold, but existing in a state of harmony with it. The station was in stasis, a perfect machine requiring no operator, a closed system that had reached its final, most elegant state. Months passed, or perhaps only moments. The sun made its tentative return to the horizon, a sliver of fire that did not dispel the darkness so much as paint it with a single brilliant line of gold. The light touched the Persephone, glinting off its frosted windows. Inside, the illumination did not change. The alien sun was a distant, irrelevant phenomenon, a flicker in a reality that had moved beyond such things. The snow continued to fall, to drift, until the lower levels of the station were buried, the metal hull becoming one with the glacier. The process was slow, natural, and peaceful. The station offered no resistance. It was being accepted, absorbed back into the landscape from which it had been so violently ripped. Years turned. The logbook on the desk remained, the paper brittle but preserved by the constant, dry cold. The graphite words had not faded. They were a permanent record of a temporary state. Occasionally, a shift in the ice, a settling of the continent, would cause the desk to tremble. The pencil would roll a fraction of an inch. It was the only movement. One day, a new sound whispered through the corridors. It was not a tap. It was the faint, metallic groan of the station's hull succumbing to the immense patient pressure of the ice. It was not a sound of destruction, but of integration. The metal was being persuaded to rest, to yield its rigid shape to the flowing glacial will. The Persephone was sinking, being embraced by the ice, pulled gently down into the deep, ancient freeze. As the walls of the mess hall began to slowly deform, the light within never flickered. It shone on the bending metal, on the encroaching blue ice that now filled the doorway, a crystal clear and impossibly hard. The ice moved into the room, not as an invader, but as a returning host. It enveloped the chairs, the table, the desk. It crept over the logbook, encasing the final entry in a perfect transparent sarcophagus. The words were still visible, frozen in time. A story preserved not for anyone to read, but simply because it was a part of the whole, a fossilized whisper in the eternal quiet. The ice filled the room, then the corridor, then the entire station. The lights were finally extinguished, not by a failure, but by being physically buried, their soft glow now emanating from within the heart of the glacier itself, a faint, captured radiance. The hum of the systems was silenced, their work complete, their energy dissipated into the surrounding frozen mass. The Persephone was gone. In its place was a slight, unnatural smoothness in the ice, a subtle contour that would, over centuries, be erased by the slow, grinding flow of the glacier. The story was over. The last echo had faded. The stillness was absolute, and it was, and it would be, forever. The ice continued its work. Millennia passed in a slow, crystalline flow. The continent shifted, groaned, and settled. The weight of ages compressed the glacier, squeezing the air from its depths, turning the snow that had once fallen on the Persephone's hull into a dense, blue heart of ice. The faint contour that marked the station's grave was stretched and thinned, a ghost of a shape slowly migrating toward the sea. The story was not lost. It was merely sleeping, a dream frozen in the dark. A new pressure began to build, not from the ice, but from the world above. The climate, that vast and complex system, shifted. A long warming trend, subtle at first, then undeniable, began to soften the edges of the eternal ice. The glacier's march to the sea accelerated. The layer containing the Persephone once buried under a mile of frozen time, was drawn inexorably upward and outward. A calving event, a sound like the end of the world, sent a mountain of ice crashing into the Southern Ocean. Among the shattered blue monoliths was a smaller, darker shape. It tumbled into the churning salt water, a jagged fragment of the past now adrift in the present. Sunlight, real and unfiltered, touched the metal for the first time in over 10,000 years. It warmed the pitted hull, melting the frost that had clung to it since the long night began. The ice that had encased the mess hall began to weep, dripping away in slow, cold tears. A section of the outer hull, weakened by time and pressure, broke away, revealing a glimpse of the interior. The light found the desk. It shone through the clear ice that still encased the logbook, illuminating the paper, which had somehow endured. The graphite words, "The Final Testament of Dorian Vale," did not shimmer or fade. They were stark and clear, a message from a silence that had been broken. The ice floe drifted north, into shipping lanes. It was spotted by the crew of a research vessel, a modern ship with sleek lines and powerful engines, tasked with studying the effects of the warming climate. They launched a small boat, curious about the dark, angular object imprisoned in the ice. They saw the metal, the unmistakable mark of human fabrication. A young marine biologist, her hands protected by thick gloves, was the first to peer into the revealed opening. She saw the desk, the book, the pencil. She saw the words. She could not read them from her position, but she saw they were there. She radioed the ship, her voice crackling with excitement and a strange, unaccountable dread. "They are coming for me now. I can hear the thrum of their boat's engine, a new noise, alien and sharp against the gentle lap of the waves. They are calling out, their voices eager, questioning. They think they have found a relic, a piece of history. They do not understand what they are about to bring back to the world of noise." The ice around the logbook is melting. As the first hand reaches in to retrieve it, a final, paper-thin sheet of clear ice slides away from the page, falling and shattering on the deck. With a sound like a tiny bell, the story is no longer frozen. It is free, and the stillness within it is beginning to wake. The first hand to touch the logbook was gloved in synthetic fiber, a material unknown to the world when the Persephone was built. The biologist, Anya, lifted it with a reverent care, the book feeling impossibly light and fragile in her grasp. The cold that radiated from it was not the chill of a forgotten place, but something deeper, a core of absolute zero that seemed to suck the warmth from the air around it. On the deck of the research vessel, under the stark Antarctic sun, a small crowd gathered. Anya laid the logbook on a sterile tray. The pages were brittle, but intact. The words were perfectly legible. She began to read aloud, her voice hesitant at first, then gaining strength, projecting Dorian Vale's final thoughts to the scientists and crew. They listened in a silence that was at first respectful, then deeply unsettled. It was a ghost story, but one without a ghost. It was a story about the silence itself. When she finished the final entry, the one that spoke of the stillness winning, no one spoke for a long moment. The only sound was the wind whipping across the deck and the distant cry of a gull. It was then that the ship's systems faltered. The constant, reassuring hum of the engines did not stutter or die. It deepened exactly as Dorian had described, dropping into a resonant, sub-audible drone that they felt more than heard. The electric lights lining the deck, bright in the gray afternoon, softened, their light bleeding into a pale, moon-like glow. A collective unease swept through the crew. It was not panic, not yet. It was a profound, cellular disquiet. The world had not changed, and yet it had. The air felt thicker. The horizon seemed closer. The vibrant, noisy world of the living ship felt like an intrusion, a temporary, garish spectacle. Anya looked down at the logbook. The graphite words seemed darker now, as if they were absorbing the new, softer light. She felt a strange pull not to read them again, but to simply be near them. The frantic worry about her research, the anxiety about her career, the memory of an argument with her mother that morning over the satellite phone. All of it felt distant, trivial. A weariness she had never known seeped into her bones. It would be so easy. A voice that was not a voice seemed to suggest. To just be still. The ship's captain, a pragmatic man named Larson, shook his head violently, as if clearing water from his ears. "It's the atmosphere," he barked, his voice unnaturally loud. "A localized pressure phenomenon. It's affecting our equipment and our minds. We need to get that book into a shielded container. Now." But his order felt like a meaningless noise. Anya watched him, her head tilted. His face was a mask of frantic emotion, a flickering, complicated fire that was exhausting to behold. She looked past him, at the serene, endless ice field from which they had retrieved the logbook. That was truth. This was just noise. She saw the change begin in the youngest deckhand, a man named Eli. The constant jittery energy that defined him simply drained away. He stopped coiling the rope in his hands. His shoulders slumped, not in fatigue, but in release. A small, peaceful smile touched his lips as he stared out at the water, his eyes losing their focus, reflecting not the sea, but the vast, starless dark that Dorian Vale had described. "They are not attacking us," Anya realized with a clarity that was both terrifying and beautiful. "They are simply here, and they are reminding the world what it is made of." She closed the logbook. The cover was cold against her bare skin as she carried it toward the insulated sample case. With each step, the drone of the ship deepened, the light softened further, and the frantic noises of the crew began to fade, one by one, into a welcoming and ancient quiet. The sample case was a heavy, lead-lined thing, designed to contain radioactive rock cores. Anya's fingers fumbled with the latches, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were moving through deep water. The world had taken on a muffled, padded quality. Captain Larson was still shouting, but his words were just shapeless sounds, bursts of static against the pervasive, humming silence. She saw his mouth moving, his face a contorted mask of effort. But the meaning could no longer reach her. She placed the logbook inside the case. The moment the lid closed, a tremor went through the ship. It was not a violent shake, but a profound settling, as if a great weight had been accepted. The drone of the engines ceased to be a sound and became a state of being, a vibration that unified the ship, the sea, and the sky. The pale internal light that had emanated from the logbook now seemed to bleed from the very metal of the deck, from the crew's own skin. Eli, the deckhand, was the first to sit down. He simply folded his legs beneath him on the cold deck, his back against a bulkhead, and looked out at the ice. His breathing slowed, becoming so shallow it was almost imperceptible. The frantic energy that had defined him was gone, replaced by a profound and untouchable peace. One by one, the others followed. The chief engineer emerged from below, his tools hanging forgotten in his hands. He looked at the softened lights, listened to the deep, integrated hum, and nodded slowly, as if recognizing a truth he had long forgotten. Captain Larson was the last holdout. He backed away from the gathering stillness, his eyes wide with a primal fear. He stumbled toward the bridge, his boots echoing with a hollow, lonely sound. He would radio for help, he thought. He would fight this. But when he reached the bridge, the instruments had changed. The radar screen showed not blips and vectors, but a beautiful, swirling pattern of static, a visual representation of the quiet. The communication equipment emitted only the same deep, placid hum as the engines. He turned and looked out the reinforced window. The sea was perfectly calm, a sheet of polished gray glass. The icebergs, including the one that had birthed the Persephone, stood as silent, white sentinels. There were no more gulls. There was no wind. The world had been paused. Anya walked onto the bridge. She did not look at the captain. She went to the co-pilot's chair and sat down, her gaze fixed on the horizon. There was no fear in her eyes, only a deep, weary acceptance. She had spent her life studying the frantic, teeming noise of life in the ocean. Now, she was studying its absence, and she found it more beautiful. Larson opened his mouth to plead with her, to command her, but the words would not come. The thought that formed them unraveled before it could reach his tongue. The concept of a command, of one will imposing itself upon another, seemed ludicrous, a child's game. He looked at his own hands, at the frantic pulse in his wrist, and saw them for what they were. Temporary, complicated knots in a fabric that was now smoothing itself out. He let out a long, slow breath. The tension left his shoulders. The fight was not over. It had simply been revealed as never having been necessary. He walked to the front of the bridge and stood beside Anya, looking out at the stillness. He thought of his wife, his children, their noisy house full of laughter and argument. The memory was a single bright shard of a broken vase. It was beautiful, but it was a part of the past. Here now, there was only the endless, tranquil present. The ship drifted. The hum deepened, softening further, widening until it was the only thing, the canvas upon which the universe was painted. The lights on the bridge dimmed to a soft, eternal twilight. One by one, the crew's heartbeats slowed, their brain activity settling into a single, coherent wave pattern, a final, sustained note of neural harmony before the long, quiet rest. The research vessel was no longer a ship. It was an extension of the Persephone's reliquary, a new vessel for the same ancient silence. It floated, a ghost on a glassy sea, its story merging with the one it had tried to recover. The logbook rested in its case, its message delivered, its purpose fulfilled. The stillness had not just returned, it had grown.